And then agency updates are another one that there's a lot going on, and that will probably take more time than it normally does. But that's the primary items on the agenda, unless someone has a burning issue that they feel needs to be added. That's where we're going to go today. For those who came in late, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Dave?
Dave Pellets, Thunder Basin Grazing Association and Thunder Basin Grasslands Grazing Association.
Brian Keel with Kennedy & Co. out of Sherman.
Back over here.
Jackie King with Congressman Loomis' office, Casper.
Kelly Carpenter, Senator Ramsey's office, Casper.
Thank you all. No other issues, then public comment. Yes, Mary, go ahead.
Under the governor's safe grouse implementation strategy, livestock grazing has always been treated as a de minimis activity, but there's more and more scientific evidence that livestock grazing can have an impact on safe grouse, and in fact, the threshold that's been discovered has a 7-inch double height in nesting and brood-rearing habitat, and that was first published by Connolly and others in 2000, but that was based on earlier studies that go back to 1994. And Christian Hagen and others empirically tested this based on all the studies that were out there on grazing at double height and sage grouse, and found that indeed 7 inches was the right height. It's also notable that the recent Montana study that was published indicated that that stubble heights need to be 7 inches, and in fact that study found that livestock grazing was compatible with sage grouse, but all 3 years of that study had an average stubble height of greater than 7 inches. Another study by Prater in southeastern Utah found that for venison sage grouse, the occupied habitats had stubble height that was greater than 7 inches, and the unoccupied habitats had stubble heights that were less than 7 inches. Importantly, of course, the livestock industry has gotten pretty fast here. Certainly the oil and gas industry has played the primary role in depressing the sage grouse populations, probably in the state of Wyoming. And those, it's true that the oil and gas industry has destroyed tens of millions of acres or millions of acres of sage grouse habitat across the state. But the spotlight of the Endangered Species Act protection is now on Wyoming, and it shines on all of us. And we need to make sure that all of the different folks who might possibly be having an impact are doing everything they can, doing their fair share and their part to help this situation. To the extent that there are ranchers that are already maintaining 7-inch double heights, they're probably not going to have to change what's going on. But to the extent that there are ranchers that are grazing past that 7-inch double height requirement, this is the key hiding cover for sage grouse when they're in their nesting and brood-rearing phases. Sage grouse depend entirely upon being cryptic during this time of year. And if you take away that grass cover, then the sage grouse aren't going to have what they need to hide from predators. Now, it's real popular in Wyoming to blame the predators for increased amounts of predation across the landscape, but it's important to note that if the livestock grazing is taking away the cover the sage grouse need to hide, then the problem isn't the predators, the problem is the livestock grazing. We need to address that. So that's something that I hope the sage grouse implementation will take up and cease to treat as a de minimis activity. We've been seeing declines across the state in all the different core areas. You can't blame that all on oil and gas development. Some of that might be some other impact, and the common denominator across the landscape in Wyoming is livestock grazing. So that's something that we need to start addressing here in this particular spot. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, I feel like it's Groundhog Day. Once again, I'm here asking that the SGIT provide me with the statutory authority for the governor to include private land in the core area. I'd like the actual law to be cited. As I have asked many times before, I additionally want to know how a private landowner can appeal the inclusion of private land in a core area. Every time I've asked these questions, I have received answers to questions I did not ask, and no answer to my original questions. Usually the reply is a repetition of the governor's authority to direct state agencies. From the amount of stonewalling that has gone on, it's obvious that the governor cannot cite a law that authorizes him to regulate private property for sage grouse. The governor has used the power and prestige of his office to run over the rights of landowners. This king-like power that the governor is using should be of concern to SGIT. Without a solid legal foundation for your efforts, core strategy is popular right now, it will not continue to be as more landowners and industries are faced with your rules. Some of the advantage of the core strategy is rapidly being eroded by the BLM adding additional regulations where they have authority. At some point, a legal challenge may destroy the executive order. A similar effort with the lesser prairie chicken did not stop the bird from being listed. SGIT should recommend legislation that would provide a solid legal foundation for grouse conservation. The governor's latest letter to me proposes that I should involve myself in the effort to reevaluate the executive order. Considering that the majority of the members of SGIT have no financial or personal stake in sage grouse conservation, it isn't likely that my ideas would receive a fair hearing. It is much easier for you to propose rules for others to obey. The fact that most of you will not face the regulatory mechanisms you devise is probably why SGIT has no concern about providing due process. SGIT and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have no respect for private property or the constitutional rights of landowners. The ownership of land is no different than the ownership of intellectual property or any other form of property. Yet SGIT proposes to limit the right of landowners to use and enjoy their property. The very idea of the executive order is suspect when you consider that the sage grouse survived quite well for a long period of time without any regulations to protect them. While big game populations declined during settlement, grouse populations thrived. Without a true understanding of what actually happened to the grouse, then we are just exercising our prejudices. Those who already oppose livestock raising or mineral development will blame those land uses when the subject is sage grouse or global warming or whatever. It is by design that the sage grouse conservation efforts increase federal control of private land rather than directly help the bird. I wouldn't be surprised if on my ranch it turned out that each sage grouse had over 1,200 acres of habitat. Your restrictions do not recognize that in much Wyoming you were protecting an empty habitat. Where good habitat for grouse already exists, the only real option is to protect the grouse from predators and disease like West Nile. The BLM is protecting a raptor nest on a power line on my ranch that is derelict. You can't have it both ways. I recently contacted the BLM about an oil well on my ranch where no reclamation has taken place since the well was drilled over 5 years ago. The well is located within the core. The BLM explained that there is a limit on the number of violations it can pursue at any one time per operator, and that the oil company is in bankruptcy. The well has not produced oil for several years. Because of some bureaucratic issues, the BLM is reluctant to act. On state or fee minerals, the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission would go after the bond and reclaim the site, while the umbrella CCAA encourages landowners to make surface use agreements that benefit the grouse. The agency entrusted with managing the federal government's minerals will not act to protect the surface. These are the kinds of things the SGIT needs to hear. SGIT has little understanding how things work in the real world. SGIT derives its power from the fear of what will happen if the grouse is listed. The fear is an obscene thing as it is used to trump valid existing rights. The old saying is, where there's liberty, the citizens don't fear their government. Our federal government can destroy the economic opportunity in the name of protecting the environment, while at the same time it fails in its mission to actually protect the environment. Thanks.
Thank you. If you want that included in the minutes, we get to Mary.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments? Yes, Robert.
Our primary core areas in the state of predominantly sheep country. Sheep feed on sagebrush. What they do is make it stew out and have pressure growth, which helps the sage grouse. But it's strange, isn't it? You know, this gentleman talked about predator control. Now, those sheep men, first thing they got to do is pay their bank and pay their debts. And what's left is theirs. What's left after the predators get done with them is theirs. That's the reason they have such good credit control on their places. And that's the reason sage grouse are there. Primary core areas have been predominantly sheep country. Now, do they have a 7-inch stubble height? There's part of this state on a good year will never make 7 inches. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? All right, Tom Christensen, do you want to come up to the table and kind of walk us through the proposals? What I think we'll do, you're the sage grouse guy from the state. Come on. You perform better when it's a surprise. We'll help you. We had asked for a variety of proposals with some focus on that was given by the legislature. And Larry, in a minute, if you want to comment further, I think it might be helpful. A couple areas that in particular they wanted to look at were within a year. Can we roll up, can we have ongoing research that we can get the analysis done, those kinds of things? Are there gaps that we have in our data collection? So it was really an open call, but there were some points in there that we really wanted to hit. I felt very good about the submissions in the perspective that we got a lot of what we asked for, and we also got a lot more that went beyond that. So the team that was assembled included BLM, Dana Fish, Governor's Office, myself, who else was on that? I think. Anyway, we got together, went through all of the different ones, and then ranked them basically similar to the way my board does their rankings on projects. So 1, a 2, a 3. Went back through and analyzed what we liked, didn't like. Some of them we actually went in and said, for instance, we had a proposal which will be presented that we would like to see you approve or recommend. Had an astronomical overhead fee which was reduced. We've got every variation from what level of detail we went to in making these recommendations. But what I'd like to do is have Tom just give a brief synopsis of each of the ones that came in, and then we can go through those that we believe should be funded, and obviously some that will not be funded. The one thing I would say about this, because it is important, we had $1 million. We held $200,000 back because we believe there's a good chance that we will probably need that as we get closer to the rollout. We may need that for an immediate analysis or something. We may need to supplement this Whitford to produce some maps, things like that. We didn't want to spend it all right now. We said we're going to be try to be right around the $1 million range. And that obviously limited what we could do because the applications totaled $2.4 million. So we're basically able to fund about half of what the request was. And that's kind of the process that we went through. Larry, does that sound consistent with what the legislature had asked us to do as far as their directive to the governor's office and the conversation and debate that took place in appropriations on the floor?
Yeah, I think for the most part, the most critical component is to be able to show all the conservation measures that the state and other partners have been put in place prior to the listing decision in September of 2015. So I think that was a part of the rationale for this. We want to show the effort that the state and the other conservation partners have put forward to protect sage grouse.
Okay. All right, Tom, you want to start walking through them?
Okay, do you want to go in ranked order or the order?
Ranked order.
Okay. And if I butcher any of these and the project applicant is here or the other people on the group, but please correct me because I literally have most of these in 2 weeks. So we had several that were ranked number 1 or received a ranking of 1. I don't know that they were ranked against each other. So this next group of 2, 4, 6 is all at the top of the pile. I'm just going to go through them in the order that are on this ranking sheet. All that represents a 1 through 6 order. The first one is from Campbell County Conservation District, a review of abandoned unoccupied flex in their area. They proposed positioning remote cameras on abandoned lake sites to try to determine if they are being reoccupied. They asked for a little less than $8,000. Do you want me to go into the discussions or just describe the proposal?
Well, I think go through the rationale. We'll all jump in, but please. On this one, for instance, we talked about whether they really needed to use the remote cameras, whether we would pay for the time and manpower to actually go out and do the on-the-ground assessment, do check for droppings and that sort of thing. That's the detail we got into. So,
And the reason for that is because grounds do leave dropping. So if they have to go out twice to set up and take down a camera, you could go out twice and look with a sign the camera's already looking at. Save the money on cameras, perhaps add more personnel time and expand the effort. So that was the rationale. That it was well ranked, but a little different technique was suggested.
Do you want us to make comments?
Sure.
We've done this for 4 years. Problem with cameras is that you've got to point them right where the grounds are. The grounds are anywhere around, and you've got very limited field of view. We always go out and look for droppings to position cameras. So that would be something, I guess I'd second that looking for droppings may well be more effective. Cameras only get where you want them, which is in the 360.
Could you maybe review for everybody the classes of active, inactive, and abandoned?
What does that mean, definition? Okay. An occupied lek is one that has had birds observed on. The person meets the definition of a lek, which is multiple birds, multiple observations, confirmed lek site. And occupied lek is one of those had birds on it observed at some point in the last 10 years. Unoccupied lek has to be documented as inactive, meaning no birds confirmed, multiple observations annually, for at least 4 out of 6 years. Some of these get convoluted, but it's trying to make sure we have good enough data to put it in an occupied or unoccupied category because management stipulations based on that category. So we want to be able to back up when we say it's occupied or unoccupied. The reason for the 10-year period on occupied lek is because we know during these population cycles that some leks will go inactive, and then when we have an upswing in the population at the same site, will become reoccupied. So that's the reason for that 10-year criteria before we take a lek off the occupied status. There's also an unknown status where it's in no man's land. Maybe it's difficult to access for private land reasons or topography or spring conditions or whatever. And those are unknown leks, or maybe just isn't visited enough. It used to be unknown leks were protected like an occupied lek, but we've due to the increased amount of sampling we've done and increased effort, we've expected our field people to get to those and really determine whether they are occupied. So those receive same protections as an occupied lek because we've given those unknown leks plenty of time to do something. Is that intuitive?
Abandoned, I mean.
Oh, abandoned, well, that's just a reason for lek becoming unoccupied. Abandoned is the habitat's still there in large measure. It hasn't been mined through, for example. A lek that's called destroyed, the site isn't there. There's nothing to lek on anymore. Abandoned, the basics of the habitat are still there, but the birds aren't there probably due to a population decline due to whatever reason, but structurally most of the habitat is still there.
Thank you.
other. Okay.
I guess I'll do this. So when I look at the RFP, the request from the governor's office, and I look at this proposal here, I mean, what is the question that we're answering by determining if these leks are being reoccupied? Is it related to core? Is it related to policies? What is it related to that we can use to give to the service and say something that has been done to conserve sage grasses resulting in more leks becoming reoccupied?
Yeah, Yeah, that's a good question, Bob. I think that the reason this one resonated with the group is that one of the issues that perpetual issues that comes up is what's going to end, what will be the end result of the development that took place in Northeast Wyoming prior to the executive order at fairly dense spacing, and anecdotally, if you talk to people, Tom Ackley up there, I think Tim Morrison probably can tell us the same thing. We're starting, now that that play is over and there's reclamation is taking place and we're taking some of the infrastructure out, the birds appear to be kind of working back into their older patterns of habitat use. That's important for us because obviously we want to be able to track if we're able to bring those populations, get them more robust and bring them back. But more importantly, in 2015, when we look at redrawing our core areas, if we have reoccupation up in that area where we lost a lot of birds, that probably should guide whether we look at expanding existing core areas or actually building core areas in places where we really had no reason to have them at the time. So I think that's why this one really kind of rose to our attention. We don't know enough about what's going on up there, and we've had some pretty major changes. If you look at 20 years, we've gone from very little development to very intense development, now back to much less development. We probably better have a pretty good handle on that.
But our hope is that the birds are going to reoccupy old leks.
Correct.
Is there a review aspect for it for newly occurring leks on the same landscape? Or?
I would assume, Tom, you can answer this, I would assume that that would be picked up in the annual survey as Game and Fish is doing and that some of the companies do.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, anytime anybody's in the field, there are lek searches, you know, so for example, these folks are going out there, you know, we would certainly encourage folks to look at that letters, but so that, yeah.
Penny?
I think this has a lot of merit because before I left the basin, Brian, if you can chime in, if you can remember that far back, we flew the main fairway between 50 and 59 and picked up a number of leks by airplane, and then there was only one that we had access to, and we continued to monitor it in the 40-acre spacing, and those grouse were coming back in that space. It wasn't a huge number, but we didn't have a lot of acres that we could do our surveys, so I think you're going to find some repopulation because we found it, and it was still during the intensity.
Yeah. Okay,
Do you have
anything else on this
Brian?
one?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, those surveys, I think, went for 6 or 8 townships in the most south section through the historical.
And I'm trying to remember how many we found.
2 that we found, so one remains active, I think that both remain active at this time. So they have persisted in the new locations. So, but any of those historical ones didn't have, that were unoccupied, or did not have any birds. So they were in suspect marginal activity.
If I can get some clarification, I think it's a great concept. It's exceptionally valuable. I'm not sure that the cameras are the best way to get at the information because the cameras just give you such a narrow little window in there. If you don't know where you're looking, you don't know where the sage grouse are, you're going to miss them and you're going to say, well, there's no grouse out here. And in fact, they might have been just 20 more feet outside of that pickup point for your camera or on the back side. So I think the concept is phenomenal.
So let me explain how that works before Tim gets up and rebuts everything. I think what we're asking for is a yes to approve that you think this is a good concept and a good project. We raise the issue of the cameras because when we sit down and before we write a contract with the district, we all thought that issue should be raised. Now maybe they'll resolve it for us and say, oh, we've got this fancy new camera that does a swirling 360 at 10 billion gigabytes of accuracy and records every living creature that ever walks by. Okay, great, for 8,000, we want it. But we'll raise the issue. So Tim, you want to comment?
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Ditto, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. The technology has increased tremendously just in the past 5 years with these trail cams. The ones we're proposing are able to shoot at almost 180 degrees. So depending on how they're set up on the lek, and we'll defer to our game and fish partners up in the basin and helping us do that. we've been working with Eric, in fact, that was got great knowledge of these sites. So,
Yeah, key point here is we want to know about the birds. And just to show you how much technology has advanced. Mary Flandurka, who's sitting right there, has just texted me and told me, don't forget the sign-in sheet, please. Wow, what is this? I feel like Dick Tracy. Okay, number 2.
The second one, you should all be very familiar with the concept. This is coming out of Nicholas's shop at Wyge's to go ahead and digitize all the disturbance in the core areas in the state. Currently, when a project comes in, that digitization, identification of disturbance has to be done somewhat on a piecemeal basis. It's a database that's built over time, but this project would do that on the front end, so to speak, and save project proponents a lot of time and effort, allow a lot more analysis to occur for other projects and so forth. So I think this one was kind of a slam dunk within the group that this is a useful project.
We started asking, you as a team started asking for this information 3 years ago, somewhat more impatiently 2 years ago. This one was I don't think there was much discussion. This needs to get done. So, any comments on that? Yeah.
How far are you going to go back when you look at disturbances? So a well was drilled and abandoned, which is the example we were just talking about, powder in the base. And the flame was 10 years ago it was drilled. They reclaimed it. So how far back are you going to go capture and say, is this a disturbance or is this a non-disturbance? What are the criteria and how do we segregate out those places that at one time were disturbed and are now being reclaimed?
Nicholas?
So currently our proposal is to use a combination of 2009 and 2012 imagery. The 2009 imagery would be used to establish baseline conditions. That's the closest imagery we have when the executive order was implemented. And then we have another set of imagery that was flown in 2012, and so we can do some level of understanding of how much has been added since 2009. On the issue of reclamation, that is probably still going to have to be handled on a project-by-project basis in order we have, let's say that well is in somebody's project area, and that's when we would require or request the field personnel to give us input, and boots on the ground is the only way for us to know if that area has been to return to suitable habitat. And so that level of analysis, I think, will still be handled through the review process. I don't think we have a easy way to do that on a statewide basis.
And I think the key to this, Larry, is that the digitization allows us to look at it other than one of the things we ran into early when we were trying to figure out disturbance. If you go to OGCC or you go to BLM and say, give us the permits out there, give us the units or whatever, there's a bunch of those that had no disturbance, but they're showing up as an area that is potentially disturbed. The digitization is going to show what disturbance is there. So the question, if you had that well that was drilled 10 years ago and it's been reclaimed, it's not going to show up as disturbance.
So what we would do just in the system is we would keep the feature, we would just mark it as this has been reclaimed. And so it's actually going to show up as suitable habitat for the system, but it also serves as a flag for when we review it and we say, hey, there's something different looking in this aerial imagery, we know that area is good looked at. That's been how we've established, that's been our review procedure since I've been involved.
One other question, and I guess is given the nature of the disturbances, some of them more permanent than others. These examples, compressor station for large pipeline. That's probably going to be there for worthwhile versus something like a wildfire, where higher precip decrease allows within 10 years, maybe right back to suitable habitat. So the question I have, we're gonna come up, we're gonna say we get X number of acres of disturbance, but then we're gonna classify those as potential long-term, short-term, natural, anthropogenic disturbance. So I think, again, my concern is if we're gonna go through this exercise, that we make sure we paint the picture, this is what the day looks like. But given some of the existing disturbances that will show up on there, use the Arapahoe fire as an example, some of that very well may be suitable habitat 10 years from now. So do we highlight that and say, well, the X number of acres of the Arapahoe fire will burn, but it's a short-term disturbance. So
I think you could, but
It's done. It's already done, Bob.
Yeah, we actually, when we digitize it, we don't, it's not just this is disturbance, yes, no. It's this is disturbance, this is the type of disturbance that it is. So, we can go through and we can say, this is, the disturbance that we have associated with flow paths. This is what we have from access roads. This is what we have from wildfires. And so we do capture some additional information that can be used to then, look at that. It's not, making the individual decision of, you mentioned the Arapahoe fire. We have a feature, it's tagged, that says this is the Arapahoe fire. Making that decision on when that gets returned to suitable, that's going to be up to the boots on the ground and the biologists and those. But when we capture the disturbance, we want that level of information so we can change that.
But there is a process for changing it from disturbed to undisturbed.
I guess what I was going to add to that is that the value of this comes later as we redo it over time, whether you do it on one core area or the whole state. Because one of the things that, if you remember the work that Lyndon's group did, was identifying areas where restoration had the greatest opportunity and the highest value. We need to document that as much as we document any amount of disturbance. So that's kind of, it's the two together, but we need to have a baseline and platform to start from, and that's what this is. Other questions, comments, Lyndon?
I guess in the stuff that you've done already, Nicholas, how do you feel, what's your feeling on the accuracy that you get? I mean, I'm sure in some places, sometimes it's very easy to tell. Other places, like Bentonite country, is it disturbed? Is it natural? Is it reclamation? Is there a process going to be in place for, question mark, maybe, ground truthing, something like that? Or, I guess that's how do you feel the accuracy of the project will work out?
There's always potential for things in language look different than
oh boy.
But that being said, we're going to do this. I propose hiring a couple of different people so we can have a couple of sets of eyes on this, and have some review. Where I need the help, is where we come into this policy review type of situation. The situation we were just talking to, similar, story, has the fire been reclaimed? Okay, this is a feature that looks, for all intents and purposes on aeroimagery, like this is a reclaimed Bentonite mine. But, I can't tell for sure from Laramie. So when that comes to and coming, there's still the review for each of these processes, or each of these projects in place. So just because we're digitizing and getting some baseline conditions doesn't mean that we're stopping. And there's still going to be the policy review. It still goes out to the field personnel to look at, and I rely very much on them to let me know that, hey, this disturbance is reclaimed, or this meets the minimum vegetation requirement, and that is the procedure we have for correcting those errors. I'm not going to say it's going to be perfect right out the gate. I don't think it can ever be that. But we do, the only thing we can do is put in place mechanisms to keep it living.
And I would encourage that.
And it needs to be
leave enough money in there so that if the questions can be, if something needs to be verified, we can pick up the phone and call somebody or whatever we need to do.
Well, and I think if we have questions, we work with the land management or proponents who have been working in that area. I mean, there's a lot of people that we use as resource, including yourselves.
But by being interactive, getting it where we have it, then that would give you an opportunity as somebody locally to look at it and go, that doesn't seem right to me. That just informs our base even more. And I think that's the strength of this, is that everybody can have a chance.
Sure. You can pre-plan instead of reacting when you're trying to get something done.
Sure.
Yeah.
I like I say, I think this is just the beginning of, it'll be very useful.
You started. Okay, number 3.
This is from Dr. Beck at the University of Wyoming and Dr. Gregory, who is from Bowling Green University, working together on an analysis looking at the landscape and environmental features that impact like attendance. This is kind of this was a pack, or no, this isn't the package deal, excuse me. This is a standalone. Look at that. The second thing they'll be looking at is the configuration of existing oil and gas disturbance, and looking at how those configurations relate to like attendance rates, and they've got 52 likes identified in an existing publication that just came out that they'll be doing that additional analysis on. And then evaluating the type of extraction method to see if one is better or worse than another as it relates to sage grouse.
Questions? I think this is one of the papers that they will build off of, is Carroll's, that you all recall the presentation he made in Lander, which had to do with where are those thresholds of disturbance, and that's something that was one of the areas that we specifically asked to have addressed. So this one came in, it does exactly what we asked them there. Any other questions? Bob?
So if I'm reading this right, all this should be done by 1 May next year, is that correct? So this is going to be a synthesis of existing data.
Almost all the ones that we agreed to fund have to be a synthesis. I mean, and that's unfortunate. There are a few that aren't, but that we don't have time for somebody to initiate a brand new research project and have it have value and follow the directive we got from the legislature.
So is there any possibility of this study here? I got to look at number 8, the one right above this on your sheet. Where those folks are talking about going back to 1900 and since 1944 with that data. Is there any possibility of like this to bring in that component, that long-term look at this data?
It's actually down in 11 when Tom gets there. That's part of 11. Right?
I don't know how that that well.
Well, I'm looking at this one in the table that's right above it. And we talk about going back and looking at well data since 1900 and valve select data since 44. Anyway, so I just didn't know if there's any way to bring in a longer term perspective, and maybe Jeff and this Dr. Gregory have.
Probably not necessarily for those 52 likes. The vast majority of likes don't go back to 1949. There's a handful, there's 40 some likes of Patterson's that go to that day. And then it increases from there. So there, for most of the state, that historical perspective really isn't possible.
The answer is, if you think that's important when we get there, let's raise that question again.
But I think he's talking about adding it to this study. Could they take a longer term look at that? And we can ask them that question.
Yeah.
They can fill that in.
Right. I guess that's all.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Okay, Tom.
This is an ongoing study that's looking at the impact of raven removal on sage grouse populations, and this one has been amended. The review group required Dr. Palmer to lower the, or Utah State, I should say, to lower their proposed administrative overhead down to 10%. I think it was 37.5%. They did that. We got approval to do that. They did, in exchange, ask for some more GPS radio telemetry equipment. So trading overhead for actual work on the ground. So that's probably a good trade. They also, that wasn't a one-to-one though. They actually reduced the overall cost from what you have on your sheet, which I think says 125 and change, down to 109 and change. So it's actually a lower price now, but with more work going on the ground.
Questions? There were several that obliquely or otherwise touched on the predator thing. We felt this was the best, most thorough analysis and probably the best person to do it. Dr. Mike Conover's done a ton of this stuff, very highly regarded, and we thought that was the best of the best. So, yes, Mark.
Just a comment. Same type of study is going to be done in Idaho. And so Fish and Wildlife is looking at this as being maybe not cost effective. I understand Dr. Conover's been doing this for a few years now. The other thing to remember is that in the 2010 decision, predation was not a primary threat. And so we're looking at it as what's the value added. We think there's some other projects that probably would give more value added to conservation of the bird. So just a precautionary comment on that.
Other. All right. Beck.
The next one is kind of a multi-fingered overall project with several components within it. I need this number here. They submitted 6 different components. One, looking at core area metrics for sage-grouse conservation. 2, trends in sage-grouse and sagebrush obligate passerines, looking to see if all the sagebrush obligates are doing the same, kind of responding the same way to the environment. Microhabitat quality in core areas, meaning looking down at the individual sagebrush and grass plants. Winter concentration areas for migratory and non-migratory grouse, and getting specific with identifying winter concentration areas for south central and north central Wyoming, and then identifying risky habitats and corvid use of sage-grouse breeding habitat. The review team wanted the winter related aspects of that overall project to be reviewed by the Sgit's winter concentration area group. And for the 6th one involving ravens, Conover was involved with both of those projects, so the comment back was see what you can incorporate of this, number 6, from the University of Wyoming study into the one we just talked about from Utah State. And then there was support for funding the other 3.
Comments? Questions?
So this one again is a synthesis of existing data. So obviously they feel like there's enough data out there to give a clear picture on the right. They like the microhabitat quality.
Yeah, it's from the existing radio stuff.
I think one of the things that maybe we all kind of knew, but not as much as we should have, is the amount of research that has gone on in the last 10 years has been almost beyond comprehension. If you add in when you got Penn State doing sage-grouse studies, and you got everybody under the sun out here, somewhere you got to pull all that together. And when you start doing it, what you realize is, my God, we know a lot more about this, but it's all in bits and pieces. So that's what I think that Jeff and his folks have taken on, is that they're going to get all that pulled together in one place.
And a lot of these studies collect a lot more data than what they actually publish paper on.
Yeah.
So I guess just out of curiosity, number 2, and again, all I can do is read the one sentence that I have here, but trends in sage-grouse and sagebrush obligate passages. You guys don't think that's been done enough already? I mean, the sagebrush obligate passages certainly have been analyzed by the service through the breeding bird survey data. And I think we've got sage-grouse trends fairly well figured out.
I think this was related specifically to hunted populations of sage-grouse. And some theories out there, or hypotheses, that hunting caused those declines. And obviously, sagebrush obligate passerines started unhunted. So looking at those same populations and deciding, well, okay, the passerines are performing the same as this hunted sage-grouse population or not. Sage-grouse numbers went down, passerines did not in this area or something.
Well, and I think that there is information. Again, it hasn't been rolled up. Steve Kinnick gave a presentation at the Western Governors looking at using passerines as an indicator of fire recovery and comparing it with sage-grouse. And one of the things they found initially in their data was, if you use fire to control juniper, you still leave the carcass, and you don't get a response from sage-grouse, but you get an immediate response from brewer sparrows. You'll get a downturn in green-tailed towhees because they were nesting in the juniper. It's probably a pretty good metric for us to have a handle on. It's just one more measure that we can look at, and I think perhaps be a predictor for when we do restoration or we go in and try and do treatments. What is the time lag where we should start seeing something happen, and what's the pattern? Probably the passerines are going to give us the quickest response, and then we know to expect beyond that. So
this is more site-specific than range-wide type of looking. Because the breeding bird survey stuff is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There's different scales.
And then if any of you want to see the proposals, they're all up here. We didn't want to communicate you with all this extra paper, so.
And what I'm going to propose we do, we'll go through down to where we cut the list down here to number 16, so there's 4 more. Then we'll take a break, and then if you want to look at them, we'll do that for about 15 minutes. Then we'll go through the rest and explain those, and if there's some that you want to add to it, we can do that later. So, sage-grouse hysterics. Mary?
Sure. Basically, what we've been asked to do, or the proposal we were asked to submit, is to gather everything that's been done in the state, all the work, the research, where the policy came from, starting back probably in the 1990s, bringing it forward, kind of showing the timeline, where we got the data, where we made the decisions, going through the notes and policies and why we made the decision, and just kind of completing everything in preparation to create an encyclopedia of what's been done on sage-grouse in Wyoming. And we would work with the University of Wyoming, Mr. Beck, in helping us do that. They've got a large catalog assembled already. What we would try to do is just put it in a chronological and logical format.
Okay.
Quick question.
Yep.
The way this proposal reads, it says it uses an extensive research database, so I'm a little confused when we talk about everything that's going on. From sage-grouse, is this going to capture federal programs or SGI, all these other things?
Yeah.
For the private local programs? It's not just focused on what research.
No. Yeah, it's on policy.
This is a policy side.
Yeah. My second question then would be, if that's the answer to the question, how does the university capture all this information?
We fudged on this one a little. We had an advantage. in that there is a PhD candidate who that is the dissertation that he has worked on for the past 4 years. But that isn't the way that the dissertation ended up, as Tom was saying, you get all this data collected, then you publish whichever part you're going to do. We're going to roll all of that into this, and that's why we thought we could do it. That's why we can do it for only $50,000. A lot of that's already been pulled together. We'll go out, double check that with the agency. So we go to Beyond and say, did we miss anything? We go to it with Brian and say, did we miss anything in SGI? And then pull it all together in one place.
I guess I still have some concerns with the idea that we're just going to tap into the agency database. How do we get these other conservation measures that may have been implemented on a ranch-wide scale? They weren't part of the university study, and may or may not be important to long-term trends and evaluations of data. And I've got numerous ranchers in my district that have walked up literally, let's say, hundreds of thousands of acres and haven't allowed any sage grouse hunting for the last 5 or 6 years. Where's that in the data?
You won't pick that up.
Where's the habitat treatments that were done by private landowners? I guess that's, so we're going to not be able to capture that data.
You won't get everything. I don't think there's any way.
Okay, well, I guess my question would be, we're not even going to try that.
Well, I think if in part, if there's voluntary, you know, like we can go out to the conservation districts and say, do you know of any opportunities that have been done? But we're really looking at the policy piece rather than the metric piece. I mean, that's going to come later. We do have a pretty good database of all the habitat treatments that were done since 1996. We did capture that with all federal and state agencies done on private land. Now, if a private landowner did it without any assistance, we didn't capture that, unless they want to. If they want to give it to us, that's great, they can.
Well, my guess would be that some of them probably would, some of them won't. But until we ask the question, they don't even know that there's a database out there. So
well, I think, Larry, I think you raised a good question, and what we can do is go back like this one and say, be certain that you have gone to all the conservation districts and asked for a roll-up of the projects within their boundaries that would be sage grouse related. That just gives us another layer that I think we may believe we have, but it'd be better if we went out and got that local on-the-ground look. So that's certainly something we can add to this.
Well, I guess not just the conservation district, I'd like to see that extended to some of the trade organizations.
Yes, sure.
The wool growers, stock growers, farm growers, they may have an idea of the activities that are going on out there. Make sure that we capture those if in fact there is, and it may come back that it's not significant. I sure don't want to go with the premise that there's nothing going on out there. Right. At least I know in my neck of the woods there's been a lot.
We make it the equivalent of data columns, and we'll do that. We'll add that to it.
And Bob, and Senator Hicks, going forward, we do have a database that should capture everything, both private, state. I mean, that's the beauty of moving forward.
Okay. Is there any mechanism, way when we're dealing with populations that are bordering other states to incorporate that data in any way?
What was the question?
Well, if we've got a
corridors that go across the line.
I guess the one I'm specifically thinking is the northeast. Connectivity that's going up into Carter County, Montana. I know there was a study that Carter County, Montana did in southern part of the state, which I don't know if it would be late or not, but it's maybe something to think about. Maybe there's other border state populations that may have something similar. Just a thought.
We're aware of those. In fact, we got that Montana study data, and should the opportunity come to this group to refine boundaries and so forth, there's some data there that could be in that regard. If that's what you mean.
Well, I guess in maybe incorporating that data into the data call for this.
Well, certainly those other states are reporting that, so it should be covered in that regard. Most of this stuff we're getting periphery, I'm not aware of too many studies that have shown this mass movement into Wyoming or something like that. The Hiawatha study south of Rock Springs would be maybe an exception to that, where the study area is on both sides. They designed it that way.
But I think a different way to look at that is that as we've developed this and worked with our neighboring states, we've got two core areas in southwestern Wyoming that are basically Wyoming birds. They're lacking here, but they spend part of the summer in Utah. The Utah piece of that we'll pick up because we're calling those Wyoming birds, if you will. If you go just over west of there, you've got birds that are Utah birds that are coming into Wyoming. Utah would pick that up, and we obviously cooperate with them on their surveys and on our group surveys. It kind of depends on whether we decide it's a Montana bird or a Wyoming bird, and then that's who takes the lead on it. But I think that's how we would roll it up in this context. Is that how you see it, Tom?
Yeah. I think that the concept is good for the university to be aware of, and that they follow.
Okay. Audubon.
One little comment that I would make, and it's basically because I'm not familiar with the proposal to write up for Fish and Wildlife. Sounds like you're preparing for a lawsuit. But this discussion obviously is beyond that. So we didn't see the conservation value for preparing for a lawsuit. So
did it scare you?
No. It's just the way it came across it. It's short enough. So
we'll make it a little more terse so that you're kind of quick. That's a good point, Mark. Thanks. Others?
On that, but when do you think you'll be done?
Well, by the deadline,
Yeah.
I mean, we're
I guess when is the deadline?
next May 15th. Yeah.
Okay, we're moving into the category of number twos. And the first one of those is from Audubon Rockies, an assessment of habitat conditions across various spatial scales, and meaning first order selection, which is a population of sage grouse, which is the core area type of analysis. Second order habitat selection is more at the LEC level. Third order selection at the scale of a bird's home range, more of an individual bird. And fourth order is the site-specific microhabitat type analysis. And Brian, is there any more you want to add to that, since this is your...
Yeah. Well, I guess I would... Well, hang on just a minute, because I'm going to have you talk about the changes we asked for. Basically, we recommended partial funding on this one because there are parts of it that can't get done in time. And, they can come back later and ask for that. But right now, that was not germane to the task that we were given. So we went back to Audubon and said, pare it down to what we need and what we can have delivered by May. And with that, Brian, do you want to talk about the changes that you made?
Sure. The basic separation is that orders 3 and 4 aren't doable in a 1-year period. What this is an attempt to do is what I've brought up in here many times, is bring the core area analysis to the point where we can actually vouch for what we're saying. That we can establish a meter, this is all based on a 1 meter pixel, by the way, so that we can work through the entirety of the core area and evaluate it for its suitability for use by grouse and likely response in population, not basing everything off of population as we've seen people tend to do too often. But looking at the quality and virtually being able to get to a point where we can evaluate a meter pixel to deal with mitigation and reclamation. Where we can say this is what it is worth to have this meter, square meter of habitat for breeding or for whatever particular part of the life function we're looking at. But so that we have some reality behind our supposition that we're doing the right thing with our 5% limits, et cetera, et cetera. so that we will have an ongoing review of the habitat as we move forward, so that we can see the trajectory, we can look at bird numbers, we can look at forms. All this, a lot of the capability here for satellite work has become, as Nicholas was indicating, rather remarkable at this point, so that we really can look at the response of the land to what we're doing. And I think that is the most important aspect of it for the work set up for us right now, to report to the service on what has been done and what is the response to the core area plan as it stands. The other two phases get us to a point where we can do this cyclically, and so we have a consistent review. We can go back and look at what we've done on the landscape over time. This broke down to, if you want me to get into the numbers, Bob, it got us to about 401,000 for the first year instead of the full numbers you see here, and that gets the phases 1 and 2. It's important to note this isn't just about Audubon by any means. This means we bring on Matt Holland, Holly Copeland, and a postgrad, so that we have somebody working on this flat out to get as much response in a short order as we can, but then to set ourselves up to do that continual review that we hope will build the DECT into something much more effective over time, because we won't look just at what the disturbance percentage is, but what actually has been disturbed and what our response needs to be to that disturbance. So it's a build out over time. Does that cover what you want me to cover?
Yeah. And we'll go through this again. We asked them to take out, they had a fairly hefty administrative fee and some other things that we didn't feel were within the realm of what we wanted to fund. So they made those adjustments, and we'll go through it. So it dropped it down to about $400,000 overall project. So, questions on that?
Not a question, just a comment. We thought that as far as our decision that we need to make next year, this information would be very helpful. If money is an issue, again, we go back to the Conover study and use that money to fund health assessment.
I think where we're at right now, we're okay from a financial side. So that's appreciated. I think we're at a point now where we're managing.
I guess the only thing I'd reiterate is the mitigation effort. We're going to see some unavoidable disturbances on this landscape, and being able to evaluate real mitigation with multipliers, et cetera, based on what the pixel disturbance is, would give us a real leg up in that direction.
Okay.
So this is satellite data.
Well, it's a mix, but largely satellite data.
Next two, Penny, do you want to talk about these next two?
The winter concentration area, I'm gonna, since you're familiar with the guts, I'll let you talk to that, but both, number 4 and number 5 are received well by the winter concentration group.
Okay, I wondered if you guys have
We didn't, not everyone has weighed in.
Well, just for everybody's knowledge, when we got into the winter thing, as you'll all recall, we had a group that has immersed themselves in that topic. They know way more about it than any of us felt like we did, and we thought before we made any kind of recommendation on it, we needed to go to them. So Penny, thanks for doing that on a pretty short turnaround, and thanks for the recommendation. So go ahead.
Well, I won't add. I actually listed these in the earlier package. That's what these are part of. Looking at both migratory, non-migratory, and then looking specifically at habitat selection models, kind of very similar to what was done for the NPL, but site-specific for South Central and North Central Wyoming, where UW has these existing studies going on with the Bentonite project up in Bighorn Basin and stuff associated with Atlantic Rail, South of Rawlins.
Okay. Let's take
There's one more there in that group.
Oh, I thought, okay, yeah. Okay.
This one, I'm not sure where the ranking came from, unless there was another group. This one just came in last week, as far as I know. And it's looking at winter use again in the Bighorn Basin by the research group that's looking at the predator issue in the Bighorn Basin. The only thing I would say about this is they're asking for flight time, and this is a new research group. They're probably not familiar with this, but through my budget, Sagehouse, Game and Fish budget, I regularly offer those researchers that may not be following their birds in the winter to pick up some flights. And so I have a budget for this, and so this is one that that I would normally just pick up out of my budget. So you may want to consider that in your deliberation.
In other words, we like the project, we don't know, the money may already be there, we'll just need to negotiate that back with Jimmy.
And we wouldn't pay any overhead that way.
Right.
Just contracted to be done.
Okay? Let's take 10 minutes. If you want to look through any of these, you can, and come back. I think we're going to try and work through lunch and get out of here at a decent time. So we'll take a the total of all of those projects that we just went through is basically the 1 million that we have to allocate with some of the adjustments that were made in number 5. Those below the line, I'm willing to have a conversation about, but let me just give you a basic. What happened is these that are below the line are either, for the most part, duplicative of the ones that we thought were the best above the line. So we chose the ones in the group that we thought were the best or the most deliverable in the time frame that we had allotted. The ones below the line, this is not a question of whether or not we thought they had merit, whether we thought they were good projects. About half of them can't be completed in time for the May, the call that we made. We can't fund something that doesn't do what we initially asked. The others are primarily things that are duplicative of what we want. So if you look at some of them, the population dynamic one number 15, that's covered by 2 that were already funded. If you look at, there's a Corbin one and Backcats, and we pulled that. The Corbin stuff was picked up by Conover. In fact, that proposal back was collaborating with Conover. So that got rolled back into what Conover is doing. We're able to combine and do that. So we're not going to go through these one at a time. I will open it up if you have questions about any of those that you'd like to ask as to why. Generally, the answer will be one of the 2 I just gave you. Again, it's not questioning the quality of the proposal. In some cases, it is cost. But ultimately, we ran out of money and we funded what we thought were the best and the most relevant applications that we had. So, are there any questions on those that you didn't recommend it either to fund later or to not fund it this time? Yes.
One question on project numbering. I did take a look at that. Just the question I have on that one was specifically when we're talking about the consider part of the economics model. And it was a little bit different than some of the other things. So really trying to figure out what are the cost efficient things contribution right. Why that's not why haven't just thrown out it's not just what we made, it's just all the cost efficiency of those measures. And it was the money perspective why don't we want the future funding with something that's constantly.
Any thoughts from the group?
Yeah, I guess I would like to see already about putting that factor in the value is not clear. I think that's just maybe
part of the conversation was that they indicated $58,000. I don't think they were convinced that this would be done very close to that, perhaps 4 or 5 times that. Those was also some concern that we created a resiliency behind fire. So they were considering it part of the proposal, so it's not enough table there, but I'm not the individual to speak specifically to that. But I know we've had some conversation about that.
And if there are parts of that you feel are worth pursuing, we can certainly go back and have a conversation with the RG and nail down whether or not they can do it for the amount that's there, and in the time that we've asked, or if maybe we ask them to do the economic analysis coupled with some others. But so if you particularly like it and you think it's something that we ought to do, then we'll move above the line. That's why we're doing it.
Well, I think the thing we just done was to develop the cost-effective habitat restoration approaches. It's really dig down into economics. Where do we need to spend our money? If there's something out there that jumps out that says it's much more effective, it helps direct those dollars that are limited to finite. So I guess that was the only thing that I really picked up on that, but I don't think it's captured in some of the other proposals.
Okay. My reaction would be, and having not seen, we're trying to respond to what's in front of us. I have to go with Jeremiah on, I don't know how you get this kind of intense scrutiny done in the period of time where the cost presented. A lot of this, I think, will come up in some of the others through analysis. But I'm left wondering how this could be done.
Well, let's do this with it, because I can, clearly there's enough interest in what is proposed there. Let's let Tom, myself, Jeremiah, Mary sit down with them and ask those questions and say, here's what our concerns are. If they can allay those concerns, then I think we can move it above the line and move forward with it. Does anybody object to that?
Would we be looking at Ask 5 specifically, or the others? Because many of the others are duplicative of others that were suggested.
Yeah, and I think that would be the other part. If somebody else is doing this already, can you do the economic piece, and what does that cost? I mean, I think that's where we kind of cut it off. I agree that I like the economic side of it, but I think the thing to do is go back to them and see if we can't develop something that hits what you guys are after, and make sure that they get it done.
Yeah, I'd be okay with you guys paring it down to see if they're interested in doing just that.
Doug, does that kind of hit with you?
Yeah, and I think as far as the duplication, everybody loves to do things twice and get paid for it. Maybe if we can just get, or talk to them, find out what you have to get this deal. Because we don't want to pay for 7 other people doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Some way.
Okay. Bob, that satisfy your?
I guess, I think I'm confused here. Are we looking at number 8?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'm not seeing the economic analysis part of it.
Number 8 on this list.
I'm looking at number 8 on the table here. This ERG analysis of the energy disturbance, I think.
Well, I'll just pass down the sheet that using the proposal.
Yeah, if you go down to task 5 on it, it says develop cost-effective habitat restoration approaches. Okay, yeah, that's not in this little summary. Right. No, it's in the actual proposal.
All right, we'll reconnect with them and see what we can come up with, and we'll let you know. Okay? Others on there? All right, let's, anything else on that, Mary? Did we get them all?
Yes.
Jeremiah, you got anything else you want to add on this? Kenny? Tom, you good? Okay. Man? Are you doing the DCA?
I believe Mike is going to do it.
Mike is, okay.
Can you help me out here?
Press it once.
Okay, I will press it 3 times. Oh, there it goes, okay. Just tell me when, because it was just a PDF. No, it's not a PowerPoint, it's a PDF. So we didn't have a lot of stuff in that from now on. It was a PDF. There was only one. If you can get it, you know.
I believe it was just the PDF sent to us. Did you like the PowerPoint?
That one see the clicker right?
No.
Yeah, so I'll just have to call for it, sorry.
Yeah,
I think she loaded it.
yeah, I got that, it's just a PowerPoint. I don't know how to get this.
You turn, off.
Wait, let me see if I can.
I didn't really use the PowerPoint too.
I can't do it.
try to hide from me.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, where are they? I don't know.
I like the microphone stated. You good, Mary?
We're good, yeah.
Good morning. Well, we're having some of the PowerPoints passed out to decision members. I'll just take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Mike Brunell. I'm actually a hydrogeologist by training. Spent a fair number of years working in government, so I appreciate the work you folks are doing on this advisory board. I've had the, I guess you say, pleasure of being involved in lots of advisory boards and trying to lead teams to decisions, and I know how complex it is. I currently work for Chesapeake Energy. I'm the director of regulatory for our northern asset, which is New York State, Pennsylvania, Ohio, come across the country and then shoot up the Rockies. So I run a team of folks that are permitting and affairs work, working with regulations and projects like the Douglas Fort Area Plan that we developed in cooperation with the state of Wyoming, Fish and Game, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife over the last year or so.
Next one.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So, skip one. Mary, is there another slide in between there?
No, sir.
If not, okay. Well, let me give you a little brief history of our project.
Oh, wait.
We got involved in really 2011 with our oil and gas play here in the Wyoming area. And as we did that, we encountered this executive order in the Douglas Fort area, which happens to be some of our better assets here. So through lots of meetings and discussions with the state of Wyoming and also BLM, we came forward and developed a plan for the Douglas Fort area that hopefully allows for continued development of the mineral assets and the mineral rights that exist there, and also for sustainable habitat for the sagebrush. A little bit about the Douglas Fort area. It's about 88,000 acres. I'm sure everybody's aware of that. It's one of the smallest core areas. In terms of disturbance, it's at about 15% disturbed. So on the face of it, there's no room for any additional work within the core area, which is why we developed the core area plan cooperatively with the agencies. Of that disturbance, about 12.5% of that is wildfires that have occurred. A little bit less, about 60.6% is urbanization, and about 1.3% of that is oil and gas. So although we made kind of the top cut, we're not the highest percentage of disturbance. And so we worked to come up with a way to allow for additional development in the area while also trying to offset for that development, not only on a one-for-one basis, but actually as a multiplier, understanding that our activity will have to be restored as well. Okay, so, and this ties into a lot of discussion that is actually happening this morning. The first thing that we did was look at the habitat within the Douglas Fort area, and we actually had aerial photography that Chesapeake had flown that was 15-centimeter aerial photography. We used two separate firms, both of which are here in the room today, to look at this to identify habitat that was the best habitat within the Fort area. And then we further refined that in relation to where the birds are actually using that habitat. So we can call it kind of a Lex-centered approach, if you will. So we have our Area A habitat, which is the best habitat within the Fort area. B, which is suitable habitat, but not as prime as A. And then Area C, which is either unsuitable habitat or disturbed area, with a plan that was developed to essentially avoid Area A to the greatest extent possible, to minimize impacts in areas B and C with habitat, and to mitigate and restore additional habitat within this core area.
One of the things, I guess, Lori Heath, who works with me, gave a presentation in December, and there were some questions on the funding that we took forward. Chesapeake understands that we have to restore the areas that we disturb, and that's Chesapeake and our partners. Okay, for instance, Access is in the room. So for those disturbances that are temporary, they have to be restored. Oil and gas wells, bad areas need to be restored when the work is done on them. This plan really sits outside of that, and we used as a metric essentially a 3-to-1 multiplier on our proposed disturbance, and we came up with a funding number. Not actually in the darkness of night. I think Bob actually worked through some costs on a bunch of different studies that have been done, and we used the multiplier for our planned disturbance and that restoration number to come up with about $2.8 million that we actually put in the trust fund to be used by the restoration team that we formed to develop projects to be done. And again, I want to point out that those projects are not just restoring Chesapeake oil and gas well areas. This is actually going out and finding disturbed habitat. Excuse me, work on it. Very next slide. So a little bit before I delve into the plan itself, one of the other activities that we undertook was a pretty robust survey and count this year. We actually funded, through the restoration team, helicopter surveys to find new LECs, conducted 3 flights, and we did find a potential new LEC through the Bill Hall complex. We then followed that up with ground counts to actually get a good count on the known population. And we alternated our counts between our biologists and game and fish. So we did see a big increase in population this year, about 128%. To kind of put that in perspective, the count in 2013 was 11 birds, 11 males. The count this year was 31, so significant uptick. But again, a pretty small number of birds. And I think it ties well with the plan that we have developed, which is LEC-centric, try to put restoration projects on the ground near where the animals are actually using. Next slide. I'm sorry, one thing I'll add is that we spent about $80,000 on those counts and surveys this last year, just to kind of put a perspective on how much money we spent on. So, the restoration plan. First of all, the restoration team, there's a number of folks that are actually on the restoration team that are here in this room. Everybody just raise your hand if you're participating in the restoration team. Okay, so we tried to develop a pretty broad spectrum of folks with experience to help guide this plan. And essentially what we have is $2.8 million. We have a large land area, and we try to develop a prioritized scheme to identify the best areas to do restoration in, and then go out and convince private landowners to let us do that work on the property. So we kind of came up with this 4-step process that I'll walk you through. It's important to note that we're looking at a number of different factors. So restoring habitat that's previously disturbed, enhancing existing nesting habitat, enhancing brood rearing, and also enhancing lake brood rearing. And I'll talk about active and passive projects that we kind of are looking at right now. In terms of the team organization, Access Midstream, I think as everyone knows, is no longer a part of Chesapeake. So they also joined in the operation of this plan, although they're a separate company now. We also brought Tri-Hydro on, a local Wyoming firm, to help kind of facilitate things for us, because as we went through this, one of the things we heard from our restoration team members is, I also have a full-time job. I need to be able to have somebody help facilitate the work that needs to be done so that we can get to decision points. So we brought Tri-Hydro for that project. And we also have Wes. I think everybody, for the most part, is familiar with Brian Heath. He was kind of our primary point of contact for Wes. And Wes acts also as kind of staff to the restoration team to help projects work through. And he's going to come up and talk about one of our projects in particular here in a moment. In terms of who we have on there, Game and Fish, County Conservation Districts, Stock Growers, the Northeast Working Group, the Nature Conservancy. Holly, it's nice to meet you finally in person. NRCS, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, Audubon, and University of Wyoming. And if there are others that should be added to the team, by no means is it a closed process. we will take all that want to help contribute to this process. And we have been growing, I think, a very respectable group of scientists to help us make evaluations in these projects. So I'll call it step one, but you'll find out in a second it really wasn't where we started, is how do we prioritize the areas in which we're going to take on projects? All right, so one of the ways that we could have done this is let's go knock on every landowner's door and say, hey, are you willing to let us come out and try to grow sagebrush on your property? Not necessarily the most scientific or effective method, okay? So what we did instead was that we identified some key factors. Distances to LECs, the management area, whether it's A, B, or C, land ownership, the size of the disturbance, distance to oil and gas wells, and distance to anthropogenic features, okay? And then we created, if you will, a matrix where we evaluated all of those factors within the Douglas core area to come up with a prioritization. We also did a little bit of sensitivity analysis thanks to one of our partners, the Nature Conservancy, to see if really a big swing in those factors changed the priorities. And for the most part it didn't. Okay, it reordered a couple of things, but for the most part it didn't. And the idea being, number one, let's get closer to birds. Number two, let's be able to take on projects where they count. And three, let's find landowners that are willing to work with us. So as we did that, let's see if it's pointer. So the first projects we've undertaken is down here in the East Antelope Lek. And when I say we kind of had to back up, that's because we actually approached that landowner. We'd identified that project area as being a key project area prior to the prioritization. Good news, when we ran through the prioritization scheme, it actually came out as number one. So either we got lucky or we picked the right metrics. But anyway, so that project was actually already underway before we did this larger prioritization project. And as we looked at these projects, we're looking for both passive projects and active projects. Next slide. So step two, go out and collect baseline data. We have collected baseline data on about 1,800 acres thus far this year. Again, following that prioritization scheme and getting landowner permission. And because we are an oil and gas company, a lot of times we actually pay landowners to get access to their land. So I think it was a process that both our contractor and Tri-Hydro hadn't been familiar with in the past, where when you knocked on the door and asked, can I go do a survey, the property owner says, what will you pay me? So we worked through that and managed to gain access to about 1,800 acres. Now, what's important to note is this is not necessarily the first contact with the landowners, but the first contact with those landowners that they understand that we're either trying to evaluate whether or not the habitat has recovered from pre-disturbance, okay, so it's not really good for a project, or it could use a project to be done there. So we got some feedback from some of the folks that we met with along those lines. That data collection is actually ongoing. We just had a property owner in the last couple of weeks, or actually last week, contact us in one of our top priority areas, who had told us, no, that's fine. We have plenty of sagebrush. No, thank you. Has come back now due to a number of different factors, and actually said, well, maybe I would consider a project. So we're getting the folks back out in the field, hopefully next week or still this week, to get that done before we lose the season, to be able to get that data reviewed. In terms of kind of spend here, we spent roughly about $100,000 to get this work done. We did encounter some issues with the HAP project process, the Habitat Assessment Framework. Luckily, we have Scott on the project, and he was able to help work the contractor through those to identify the issues and keep us moving. Next slide. Okay, so that was slide 2. You can skip that one. Sorry. That was the one I was looking for before.
Okay.
There it is.
There you go. Step 3, project type. So we prioritize the areas that we think need work, then you go out and collect the baseline data and decide if in fact the habitat is lacking, or what could be done on those tracts of land to improve habitat for the bird. First and foremost, active restoration. Can we go out and actually reintroduce or reestablish sagebrush? Or do we need to do treatment to remove invasive species, cheatgrass and others? And then kind of the second tier of projects are passive restoration. So we have suitable sagebrush cover, but we'd like to add in, whether it be a grazing plan or some sort of exclusion, or some, better feed for the birds to give them additional chances to thrive there. And that's kind of where we are right now. We should be getting the survey data back between now and our next restoration team meeting. And so we're going to be leaning pretty heavily on both Fry Hydro West and the restoration team to help us design projects to fit within these areas. Because then the next step after you get a kind of conceptual design is go out and contact with the landowners and explain to them what it is we'd like to do out there and what the benefits would be to them. Okay, so that's kind of where we are in terms of our overarching. Can you go back?
Oh, sorry.
Kind of overarching schedule where we are right now, and then we'll get into step 4, which is the kind of get the plans finalized and begin implementation. And I say, this is our overarching plan, but we actually put 2 projects down on the ground this spring. And Brian's going to talk about one, the Antelope Lake, and then we have Casey here who's going to talk about a graduate project that he's working on. Okay. Again, landowner agreement throughout the process is one of the biggest issues we think as a team we can work on. Identifying where a project needs to be done, gathering the baseline data, doing the design work is all entirely within our control. Getting the property owners to agree to allow you to go out there and make changes on their property is probably the hardest thing we do as a team. And I think it's the hardest thing, Sgit is going to deal with in terms of how do you put projects on the ground. Okay, a little bit about kind of stepping back out of the restoration team for a moment about what Chesapeake is continuing to do in terms of keeping, honoring the plan that we have in agreement with the state of Wyoming. Coordinating our disturbance with Access Midstream, trying to minimize to the greatest extent possible our service disturbance, minimize our development itself. So we try to focus in Area C, multiple wells, fewer paths. We actually have been making great strides for this in terms of lengths of our laterals, those sorts of things, which is going very well. Co-locating roads and pipes, those sorts of things, again, just minimization. And then finally, the site assessments. We're trying to microsite our location. So even though it may be in Area C, when we go out to do a site assessment, there may be sagebrush there. You try to move those paths around to try to avoid taking out the native sagebrush. The West Nile program is something that we're spinning up here pretty quickly. Understanding that's a big concern right now. So actually, as I was sitting in the back row, I was emailing our team back in Oklahoma City to get folks mobilized to try to move that forward from where we originally thought it was going to land on our calendar. So we can actually get folks in the field the next week or so, help make that move forward. And then coordinating with emergency management services about water for fire protection. Burns being one of the largest disturbances in the Douglas core area. We do have water staged around the core area. We actually don't have any impoundments inside the core area intentionally, but we do have water sources and things, so we're trying to coordinate that if something does arise. In fact, one of the landowners asked if we couldn't just stage tankers of water around their property in case something happened. Not necessarily the best plan, but at least it shows people are interested. And then finally, our traffic plan. One of the things that we worked really hard on was trying to do an avoidance of traffic during the time period when the birds were out on the last. Pretty big project. I'm not sure how many folks understand that we're an oil and gas company, but if you looked at terms of our activity, you'd think we're just a trucking company. Okay, we move a lot of things around in order to take the activities we do. And so in putting together a traffic plan, we essentially identified the roads that were going to be too close to the active bird areas. We had meetings with our contractors and explained to them the consequence of not following the traffic plan. We actually put private security on patrol on the roads, checking both speed and to make sure that the folks have the right authorization from Chesapeake to be on the roads. Now, it raised some awareness of some of the other folks out there. We saw these signs that said, not an approved Chesapeake route, or this is an approved Chesapeake route, but only during daylight hours. And then we tracked that so that each time a vehicle went within the DCA, we have a tracking of when they went in there, what time they went in, what time they came out, why they were there, what work they performed, and then any exceptions outside of the inclusionary actually had to be approved. And we funneled that up to 3 people within Chesapeake who had the approval authority to grant exceptions to go into the DCA. And again, to kind of put some perspective on it, it amounted to around 6,000 extra miles of truck traffic, in other words, to avoid these certain roads within the DCA to get the work done. We actually delayed a lot of our activity, about 562 hours over the period. And just to kind of put a round number on it in terms of revenue, it accounted for about $320,000 of lost revenue, because if you have a well go down just before dark and you wait until the next morning to go and get it, you don't produce the product during that time period. So there's a lot of factors that go into that, but and I really only put that number out there to show you that we had a commitment to get it done. So in terms of the projects that we've undertaken, first of all, in the fall of 2013, the team was out collecting sagebrush seed themselves. Okay, as we got into this, one of the things that became very apparent was the best thing to do was to collect local seed for the areas you want to replant. So that was the first stage. You can see the folks up here collecting the seed. But then the seed was sorted, and I think, Casey, you're going to talk about some of that? Yeah. Okay, great. So there's a large process that went on in order to get the seed from what looked like a bunch of mulch into seeds that could be planted. And it was planted both at the University of Wyoming and also at a commercial greenhouse where we currently have 20,000 seedlings being grown right now for projects to be done in the fall. So spring of 2014, in fact, just a few weeks ago, we had our first 2 projects put out there, one being the University of Wyoming, another one being a restoration team project in particular on that East Antelope Lake. We are working on the vegetative studies right now, and we have issued and received proposals for the fall planting effort through the request for proposal process, which allowed us to really kind of hone in on what the work was we wanted to get done, and we think it is some pretty good costs to make that happen. And then finally, landowner education and outreach. Can't harp on this enough. If the landowners don't want you out there doing projects on their land, it's very difficult to make any sort of progress. So in the design of the projects, they have to be a partner in that and be willing to kind of understand how important it is to get the project done and what the potential is for them down the road, whether it's banking or whatever, but also that it won't disrupt the activity they currently have going on in the land, so that they can continue to use the property. Next slide. So I'm going to ask Brian to come up and talk about this East Antelope project and kind of what we're doing there. And this may be your chance to ask Brian questions if you want to.
Mike? One of the first projects, again, that was established is in and around the East Antelope Lake, which accounts for about 70% of the birds of the Palisades grouse counted on Waxman and the Douglas Core area during this past spring surveys. So obviously it's a very important lek. We want to keep birds on that lek, knowing that in the past, in terms of that individual lek there was there's 2 burn areas. This is a 2012 burn area, and then this is a burn that the landowner couldn't remember, but it's at least 20 years old. Sagebrush has basically been removed from both of those areas. The 2012 burn encompasses about 92 acres. This burn is approximately 170 acres in size. Initial discussions with the landowners, or the landowners that we had, again, trying to at least establish that any project we put out there would have to be somewhat beneficial or approved by that landowner and benefit sage grouse
if we are going to fund and implement that. And then the initial thought from the landowner on this was, yeah, I'll let you or consider letting you put a little bit of sagebrush out there, but I do not want a sea of sagebrush established back out there. So, and I think, at least in talking with some of the other landowners in the Douglas Corps area, that's going to be kind of a common theme that we have out there. So we need to at least get some of these disturbances that are out there trending back towards suitable habitat at a rate that basically the landowners will still allow, and then over time, we basically trend towards meeting that 5% sagebrush cover. And then in dealing with the landowner too, one thing that he brought up was that historically, this reservoir, although it shows on this aerial imagery is containing quite a bit of water over recent times, it typically goes dry in the summertime, late summertime, it doesn't provide water. So our thought was to try to identify areas where sagebrush could be planted that would capture snow and allow basically that runoff to be captured in that stock pond and provide some water for his livestock and for wildlife use within that area. Our initial baseline data that we collected within both burn areas indicated that perennial grasses and forbs were fairly robust within those areas, fairly good coverage, not a lot of invasive species that were out there. So what we identified was that, okay, in terms of looking at the executive order of sagebrush habitat suitability requirements, what was lacking was the struggle component out there, and that's what we needed to look at reestablishing. And presented that to the landowner, came up with some options, and the restoration team felt that kind of planning along linear features or kind of contours is we call them would be the best way to go, where you establish little sagebrush islands, use those seedlings that were grown, and then put those plugs back out there, use those little seed source islands, and let over time those things colonize or populate those areas with sagebrush. And so what we have is we have contours. The purple area is the perimeter of the burns, and then there's pretty robust sagebrush habitat adjacent to those areas. Fairly good native grass component within there, especially this year. It's an awesome year for herbaceous production within the Douglas Corps area due to all the precipitation we've got. And then each of these contours are placed 60 meters from the edge or the perimeter of that burn. We've selected those contours to start our little sagebrush island plantings that are out there. These little block areas, we've got exposures set up with sagebrush planted within those exposures, netted off so that rodents or herbivores can't go in and graze off all those plants. This spring we planted 81 sagebrush seedlings at a density of about 1.4, I think it is, plant per square meter within these exposures along those contours. And we also presented the landowner with an area of a block design. In other words, against a bigger area, lower density of sagebrush out there, is that something that would be favorable to establish sagebrush over a little bit broader area and not have all these little micro exposures sitting there. They went with that. Again, each of these are basically set above drainages where hopefully snow will be captured over time and then run down into that drainage. The UW project that Casey's going to talk about, again, are along contours up here and the more recent burns. Got good perennial grass that's been established, the fork component that's coming in, and sagebrush is the only component that's lacking in terms of habitat suitability for sagebrush. The intention of what we're looking at now, or at least out in this area, how it differs from the UW project, is we've got sagebrush seedlings were planted the same way. We went with wood mulch on top of it to try to reduce competition with sagebrush seedlings that are out there. UW did a little bit something different. And once we kind of monitor these plants throughout the summer, and again, so far we put in, I think, 468 plants. Only 2 of them have been dug up. So at least all plants are surviving, doing well. They're starting to send out additional leaves or buds up top on those plants, and we'll take that information at the different density of plantings that are out there, different designs along these contours, and plan an overall larger project for this fall so that we can trim this whole area back towards suitable sagebrush habitat over time. Again, working with the landowner, again, he's not going to allow sagebrush to be established across this entire area out there. One of the concerns that they had too is there's a 2-track road that's used by the ranch, kind of bisects that area. For the most part, again, he's kind of restricted any sagebrush planting in close proximity to that road, the rest of it, because he doesn't want it to get drifted in with snow and exclude his use during the winter time if he wanted to go down there, or when he had cows in there in the fall. So overall, again, once we get the baseline data back, we'll utilize that information to kind of work with landowners and plan an overall project to return this area to suitable habitat, and then also try to maximize snow capture so that he has water available for his livestock and wildlife use within this area. And I'll turn it over to Casey, who has a project that I kind of sure. Sorry, Casey. False alarm. So the projects that we're looking at are not what I'll call kind of typical mine restoration, right? It's not a recontoured surface. This is land that's either been burned off or it's actually been treated off by the property owner because they wanted to get rid of sagebrush. So it's a little bit different than going out and broadcasting seed. So we did go pretty purposefully down the road of growing seedlings, try to get the jump start on that to be able to compete over time with the existing ground cover out there. One of the things that's been, I'll say, interesting to folks that are actually contacting with landowners is explaining to them when we're talking about a 5% habitat cover, what that looks like, right? Because they are somewhat resistant, right? These are folks that either they did or their older family did remove sagebrush from this land, and now we're saying we want to bring it back, right? So these photos, and I apologize, they're not maybe as big as we need to make them, although the city members should have a handout. These photos display, this is 2%, this is 5%, what we're trying to get to, and then lastly, this is 17%. And getting the point across, I think, of what quote suitable habitat looks like is something that I think the decision should have in mind as they work forward. Because if the thoughts of the landowners are they're just going to have a sea of sagebrush that's going to be pretty much unusable for their cattle and their other livestock, it's going to be pretty difficult to move that forward.
How are you planning to go from the patchy plantings to a broader scale 5% canopy?
Well, and Brian may be able to answer that, but at this point, so some of the things the restoration team has talked about is what sagebrush planting has been successful. Okay, so first it was go to the seedlings, put seedlings in, remove competition from around the seedlings to allow them to get established, protect them from rabbits and antelope and cattle so they don't get eaten. And then the expectation is that they propagate essentially downwind in a normal manner. And so that is some of the discussions we're having now. The restoration team is it more effective to build large blocks? Okay, so you have a large block that would propagate the downwind from the edge of the block, or to put in what we call mini blocks or micro blocks, where you're some number of meters wide, but you follow a contour that's essentially 60 meters apart, okay? And you create a density within your block that would exceed 5%, that would continue to propagate downwind, right? So over time, you would fill in, and doing it that way, you still allow the ranchers access to their property, right? So they don't say, well, I want to do this. And so that's kind of the design we're looking at right now. I mean, if your islands are big enough, you could get 5%. Without filling in the intermediary. Time will tell. But in terms of design components, that is one of the things that the restoration team is working on. What can you get a property owner to agree to, and what actually makes the most sense for the birds? Next slide. So next steps for us, finalize that restoration plan that we talked about, the prioritization scheme. We want to roll that out as a project out of the restoration team to make it available for anyone else that may want to do projects within the Bogan Square area to understand what our thinking was.
about what priority areas are and what projects might want to be done in those areas. We are going to produce, or we have committed to produce a an annual report to the agencies. And then we're going to continue to work on designing our fall projects because we have 20,000 more seedlings being parted off right now at the greenhouse, getting ready for fall planting. And just to continue to identify projects that will help sustain the core area strategy. We actually think that this type of a kind of collaborative work group where we find funding and go out and try to do projects is kind of the right way to attack this issue. And then the last thing, at the end of my presentation, but we did do a field trip out there, a field tour out there with the restoration team and some of their kind of management, and we'll offer the same thing to Sgit members probably in the fall of this year when we have more projects done on the ground. You can kind of see what's already been put out there and what the planning is going to happen. Gives you a good opportunity to kind of kick the tires and see what we've got going on in that territory. So I think we have a question. Am I right?
All right, thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you today. My name is Casey Balter, and I'm working on a graduate project under Pete Stahl at the University of Wyoming. I'm funded through this Douglas Core Area Restoration Team entitled Best Methods for Reestablishment of Wyoming Big Sagebrush Using Container-Grown Seedlings. Our primary objective is to develop an effective planting method for Wyoming Big Sagebrush seedlings. This type of work has received a lot of attention lately. A lot of projects have been focused on creating these seedling planted islands within disturbed areas in order to speed up succession and get a seed source back into areas. Given the long natural return interval of sagebrush mixed with 4 successive seeding efforts, we felt like we could take this method a step farther and really try to find the most efficient way to plant these seedlings over a large landscape that will both maximize plant growth and habitat quality. More broader objectives include reintroducing sagebrush back to an area where it was just removed by wildfire by performing active restoration, and then also helping conduct long-term monitoring that will provide suggestions for future projects within the Douglas Core Area, state, and even region. Secondary objectives will include 2 smaller scale studies. The first will be looking at broadcast seeding Wyoming Big Sagebrush into a series of different types of snow fences compared to just regular winter cover in February, winter seeding, which I've had some good success with recently. Then also comparing the success of bare root stock to container grown seedlings to see if there's a big difference between those 2 methods. Statistically, the study is organized into a 3-factor factorial randomized complete block design. Kind of a mouthful, but there's a kind of a combination of the 12 different treatments that will be randomly organized into each study block, replicated 3 times, giving a total of 648 seedlings needed for the project. The next slide will show how the block design will look in the field with the randomized plots put into this study block with 1 of 3 planting densities, 1 sagebrush per square meter, 2 per square meter, and 3 per square meter. So each one of these plots will be 9 square meters. Methods started, as we talked about before, with seed collection from stands adjacent to the restoration site that were not burned, given them the locally adapted traits that we required for this study protocol. That's done by the group of volunteers, wildland restoration volunteers, as well as the Douglas Core Area Restoration Team and many others that came out to do this by walking around and stripping and cutting the seed stalks into bags and bringing all that material back to a controlled environment where it could be dried out prior to cleaning. So we loaded it all up into paper grocery sacks and drove it to Laramie, where we spread it out on all the open greenhouse bench space we could find. Aerated benches with newspaper did the trick. At 3 days under 24 degrees Celsius, about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So all that material, once was dried, was taken to another part of the university to be cleaned through a series of 3 screen sizes shown in the middle picture. The top is 5 millimeters, middle is 2 millimeters, and the bottom is a fine mesh to collect all the seed. Since sagebrush seed is so small, as you go down between the different sizes, the idea is that seed will be collected on the bottom while the stems and leaves and names will be held with the finer, the larger mesh on top. And this method produced 12% PLS seed, which was adequate for seedling production and broadcast seeding, which was partly due to the cleaning process and partly due to a really good seed production year last year, so good collected material. As for growing medium, we decided to also use native soils, which was kind of a new method, but given that Artemisian tridentata has a symbiotic mycorrhizal relationship with the native soils that it grows in that can increase nutrient and water uptake, we thought that if we could jumpstart that relationship in the greenhouse and plant them in the same soils they've been growing in the field, that they might have an advantage compared to artificial greenhouse media. And so that was done with just a spade, shovel, and bucket method, walking around the landscape and taking one shovel here, one shovel there, trying to spread the disturbance out in the top 0 to 10 centimeters. Also, once that soil was brought back, it was able to dry and then sieve down to 1 centimeter, giving it a common texture for each plug. The containers chosen to use were the Rayleigh style containers. 3.8 centimeters diameter by 21 centimeters depth. It's the biggest container that this company offered, and it's pretty common for sagebrush seedlings. We filled each one of these to the top with soil, then fully saturated with water, which brought them all down in between a ½ and inch from the top, which actually turned out to be good when you're watering the seedlings. You want a little bit of area for the water to be able to penetrate and collect. So following full saturation of the soil, I used kind of a little plastic knife and created a little bit of microclimate on the top, but it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but there's a lot of little holes there, little crevices for seed to fall into. Then broadcast seeded 0.5 grams of sagebrush seed into each container, just using a spoon right out of the bag, and then kept fully moist with a spray bottle for the first 48 hours to prevent just pouring water on it and allowing that seed to float above the soil surface. And then after it was good and settled in the soil, we watered just sufficiently 3 times a day for the first week. Emergence was first noted 4 days after seeding. In this bottom left picture, just 2 leaflets coming up. And so that was a good sigh of relief when things started to come up. And then as time went on, and we actually ended up having an average of 14 seedlings come up per container. So my seeding rate was definitely a little high. And I would go back and adjust that. But being my first time, I really wanted to make sure we had seedlings and all. Yeah, exactly. So, so given 2 weeks later, I thinned down to 1 seedling per container after I was sure that I thought that they were going to survive. So this is about 4 days, 1 week, starting to produce 2 taller leaves, and then going into trident leaf form after about a week and a half. Seedlings were grown under natural greenhouse lighting, kept at about 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and allowed to grow for 65 days. The top picture shows how much root development you're going to get, even when you only have maybe a couple millimeters of above ground growth. Taproot has already reached the bottom of that container, and it is expanding quicker than you can imagine. So that was kind of interesting. As I started plucking them out, you have this much root to this much plant. Also, watering regime was stuck to 1 time daily for the first 30 days, and then switched to every other day for the remainder of the growing period. In these greenhouse conditions, I don't think you can go much less than that because they dry out pretty fast. So every other day was kind of letting them fully dry out, and those roots search for water, then give them some. Was the idea behind that. And then moved outside into a lath house, just filled with lattice around the sides and tops to get 50% of sunlight, 50% of wind, trying to hard them off prior to field planting. So field planting took place May 19th through 22nd, being a spring planting. We had good soil moisture this year, so that was a good conditions out in the field for spring plantings. holes dug using an 8-inch gas-powered auger, as seen in the second picture. And after the plugs were removed from the containers, placed in the middle of the hole, and then backfill all the soil in and compact down as much as you can around that seedling, really trying to get good soil-to-soil contact. We also brought out a 350-gallon water tank on the site and just gravity-fed a hose out to the planting location and gave each seedling half a gallon of water immediately following planting to really get, hopefully, good establishment and get the backfilled soil to connect with the plug soil. Cattle panels placed around the perimeter of the each study area prevent cattle and wildlife from and then poultry netting on the bottom 48 inches to keep out any rabbits or smaller mammals that may want to eat the seedlings. That one there on the bottom right is an example of one that has a fabric mulch treatment, and the one on the top is an example of one that does not. So monitoring is to take place once a week for the first 2 months of the study. So far, we have average height in between 5 and 6 millimeters and average width around 3.5. Survival is in the 99th percentile, so really good so far going into the heat of the summer. And so I think that everything is getting settled in quite well so far. Long-term monitoring will also be conducted annually by the University of Wyoming into the future, at least 5 to 10 years, to see when these things are going to start producing seed and what we can do to really get them to disperse outside of these seedling islands a little more efficiently. Given that, it's just a quick rundown of the process of growing a sagebrush seedling. All you need is some people to go out in the field and get the seed, and then a greenhouse to do it. And we hope to be answering a lot of questions in the future, such as how can this study be used to design projects that create savable sage-grouse habitat over large areas, which I know keeps getting brought up, which is definitely the goal of this project, is to kind of figure that out. And does a certain method or plant density increase the abundance of outside seedling recruitment? If not, what can we do? Can we treat with herbicide around there? Can we do some mechanical treatments to try to open up some establishment opportunity? Also, how long does it take for these locally adapted sagebrush seedlings to produce viable seeds within the Douglas Core area? And can these seed source islands be placed in locations with higher potential for dispersal than others, given slope, aspect, soils, surrounding vegetation, and percent bare ground? That's all I had today. Thanks.
Questions? Comments? On the students part here, I wondered if you did any soil review before planting.
Yeah, we did. We got the soils that are that map earlier that showed where the 3 study blocks are. One of them is kind of down in the draw, and that's more of a clay loam, and the ones up top are more sandy loams. So there was some alterations in the soil. pH was well within range. No problems with EC or any type of limiting factors. But we're still working on, we just did a field ribbon test, and we're still working on a lab testing in specific soils.
Yeah, one thing, Brian, if you look at that first page under advisor, Pete Stahl, yes, the soil was good.
I should have read.
Yeah.
I do think it'll be interesting to see how those respond, because we're hearing a lot about soil qualities and values and how it can play them.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we've been bugging Pete about getting involved in this. And I'm really tickled that he is in the case that you're doing this, because that questions on the back is really the part I think is key. You know, it's how do you step it up, ramp it up? Okay, if we figure out how we can do it, how do you do it more? And I think that, you know, what I've seen out here, we may have something there that could be replicated in other areas. But you're right, soils are key to how you do it. The other thing that Pete and Casey have pointed out is it may be even more important than that, maybe the local seed collection, as opposed to trying to grow something in a greenhouse and stick it in your yard. And I think that's probably got a lot of potential for success.
So to that point, even for the seedlings we're having grown in the greenhouse, we actually shipped out local soil
too,
for them to get grown in, so that they get inoculated with local strains as they come back.
No, Tom. So along these same lines, please correct my perception if I'm wrong here, but we're working in a Great Plains ecoregion, more of a sod type situation, sod forming grasses as opposed to long basins with a bunch of grasses where this unblown seed idea we know works. Is there either previous work or experience done along these lines that, yeah, we do have windblown establishment of sagebrush in a soddy area?
Yeah, there's been mixed results. Certainly, if you're in the center of a monoculture cheatgrass or something like that, your potential for outside recruitment is going to go down tremendously. This site particularly, we almost thought was like a blue grama sod, but it actually has quite a bit of perennial diversity as well as fork diversity. And the surrounding areas of established sagebrush stands are successfully recruiting out, so I think that is a promising sign. But I think that is an excellent point, and that's where I think future research definitely should address.
Yeah, Ron.
Thanks, Bob. I had a question for Mike. Slide number 3, you were talking about the population increase, and you had said 128, but on the slide it said 182%.
The slide's right.
The slide's right, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, it went from 11 birds to 31.
Which, I'll throw this out there because I see it done all the time. Anytime you see a percentage, be careful. Ask what the heck it is. If you go from 1 bird to 3, we've had a 200% increase, and that may not be enough to sustain the population forever. So go over here, Brian.
I want to be retroactively unkind for a minute and move into my comment and question. This is the project that has cost me more in trying to explain core area and support that core area than anything else I've encountered. I mean, I've been through this a multitude of times because of the way it sort of broke out of the standard approach. So making that comment, I'm going to ask that the SGIT be particularly scrupulous in reviewing what we get out of this going forward and that we make it pay. I'm not trying to go back and rediscuss this, but I think it is absolutely worth noting that everywhere I go to talk about this, I get, well, but the core, the Douglas core, and the amazing thing is I'm told, and it's the heart of core sagebrush. So all 12 of the birds would agree. But the point that I want to ask
There's
about
18 now.
Pardon me?
There's
18 now. It's 100. What I want to ask is, how are we going to relate these efforts to the general populace as well? Are we going to do website work? Are we going to have available and visible reporting on the approach? And then the second part is, are there other developers in that core area, and are they abiding by the same plan?
I'll answer the first part. So the restoration team has been hammering on, for lack of a better way to put it, to create a web presence.
Consider this an accentuation of the hand.
I hear someone else's voice when you talk about that issue. One of the things that we're being, and we Chesapeake are being careful about is, the core area strategy is the right strategy to approach. Right? We are here, we think, also for the right reasons. Providing the funding is the right thing to do this. You can consider this restoration and research at the same time. Right? So we think this is really valuable. We sat here this morning and listened to how the state of Wyoming was going to spend $1 million, right? So we're well over 2.5 times that amount that we're willing to invest in this 88,000 acres to do projects. So we think that is a significant investment and actually warrants the level of involvement that we're getting from the other restoration team members. This is a chance to do projects on the ground. And those projects will never get to where they need to get to if we don't talk about them and report results. That said, I and Chesapeake are hesitant to get out in front of reporting results before we have results. So I think that we will grow into the reporting that you're looking for and the outreach that you're looking for as we get projects on the ground. Up until just a few weeks ago, we hadn't really gotten our first plants into the ground yet. So that's kind of where we are. And we actually don't want to get out in front of the Sgit in terms of, one of the views, of this project could be that our results come back to you folks, I mean, and the reports come back to you folks. For each one of the projects we're undertaking, we're also committing to the monitoring. That monitoring over a period of time and set that money aside so that work gets done and those reports get written so we know what is successful. I don't know if I answered all your questions, but
it's a start. The second part was, are the other developers within the core abiding by the same approach, and are they part of the plan?
I think if you look at the core area, the Douglas core area, by and large, the majority of that acreage is Chesapeake. So when we talk about other developers, you know, we're probably 90% of the activity there. Access Midstream, which is our gatherer there under contract, is abiding by the plan, and all of our contractors are abiding by the plan.
If I can just say one thing to you, you talk about the 2.8 figure. That's where it stands today. That number will grow over time as they have activity in that core area. So it will grow and we will have more resources to grow.
Hopefully we'll be spending it.
I'm just saying the total figure overall will grow over time.
You're exactly right. As I meet with the restoration team every month, one of my kind of constant mantras is we need to find good projects to put these dollars to use for, because not spending the money and getting this work done will actually show that will be failure for the restoration team. To leave that money to sit there and not be used for what it was intended for.
Evan?
I'll probably need to say a few words.
Ben thought if she sat right behind me, I think she had left. Because, and I want to say a few words first.
This was a heck of a pile of work to dump on Amanda, primarily as a person out in the field who's done it. And she has emerged as a rock star, in my opinion. She's held their hands, she's scolded, she's done just about everything you could ask of her in a very timely and responsible manner. I think that it's appropriate that we ask her for her point of view, now that you've been through this for a year and taken your beatings. How are we doing out there?
Well, I think of it as a marriage. It's sort of better for worse, and I think we've gotten past the worst and we're into the better. I didn't know how big of a challenge this restoration team was going to be. It sounds easy and lofty in theory, but getting it on the ground and the way that Chesapeake has chosen to go about doing it by bringing on Tri-Hydro has just been phenomenal in moving forward with it. So I think the restoration effort is bigger than any one person, it's bigger than any one agency or entity, and can't echo enough what Mike said about working with the landowners and having those landowner contacts and having that first initial landowner willing to work with us in putting a project on their place was the best opportunity that we could have had. The research component is greatly important, and the commitment that I've seen from Chesapeake change and grow, and take ownership in the whole plan itself has been really important to me. And so, as I said earlier, they've learned to fish, and I think they're doing great at it. Time will tell. There's no instant results in this process.
Couple more, then we're going to move on. Eric?
A question for Mike. In Alaska in 2000, Phillips Petroleum drilled out the Alpine field, which was 25 to 40,000 acres subsurface from 2 well pads and an airfield. 9-acre surface disturbance, 2 well pads, that huge amount of acreage. That was 14 years ago. They weren't even in the Sage Gas Corridor area. Are you guys going to be willing to look at the possibility of doing something that integrated in terms of shrinking down the number of well pads you need so that you can fit underneath the 1 well pad per square mile cap?
There's a couple of answers to that. One, we are continually trying to push our lateral length, okay, for not just for habitat reasons, but also for economic reasons. Okay, so that is what we and every driller are trying to do. There are limitations to that. Some of those limitations come from leasing and the unitization. Okay, you can't drill 2 units with 1 well pad today. We are working with BLM very hard right now to reduce our surface disturbance by commingling the minerals. There are lots of rules for development activity. We actually have a meeting tomorrow where we're going to be working with BLM on that. And we have worked through where we have dropped our surface disturbance, Lori helped me, from a little over 6 acres down to about 4 acres on our pads through some metering changes. That's kind of how dramatic it is. We want to go further than that. So there are ways to make these changes, but it all takes time. And you have to prove up the economics and get the product out in order to do it. So the answer is yes. In fact, in the Douglas area core plan, we actually talked about longer laterals and accessing some of these higher priority habitat areas from outside, and that's what we'll continue to try to do.
And I'll answer the second part, Eric. You've got to remember that this area already exceeds that disturbance in many parts of it. But as far as what they are doing, you couple what they plan to do with restoration with the co-location and the reduction in size, any new development should be far below 1%. So we're adding habitat and shrinking footprint at the same time.
One more, and we're going to move on. Doug. The question was kind of raised about the ability for this to be replicated other places. And I think we've kind of addressed different habitat. The other thing is, maybe looking down the road, this project isn't just to grow sagebrush. It's to provide sage-grouse habitat. And I guess the question I have, and maybe this is more for game and fish, but what is the dynamics of repopulating these restored areas? I mean, is there a limit on distance, quality? I guess have you looked at that question? Because you're going to grow sagebrush, you do that. The idea is to get the birds into it.
Right. So part of that question I won't be able to answer, but there is some of it I can answer. We are not looking at just sagebrush. We're looking at the whole habitat requirement, which is why we're looking at areas where there is adequate sagebrush cover, but it may be invaded with cheatgrass, and there's no forage there. So we're looking at whether it's cheatgrass spraying to remove that and adding forbs back in. So we're looking at kind of all of those different habitat types that would be important for the bird. In terms of how do we recruit the bird back in, that is not a question I can answer. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I think we need to build it and see if they come on their own and be ready with potential translocation, should they not. But I think we're quite a long time from that tool being implemented. I don't think now is not the time to go in and put a bunch of birds. We have to have habitat base first.
But where this work is taking place, you do have birds there.
Exactly.
So I mean, that's the first answer is if there are birds there, most of the treatments that we've seen across the range, the birds will use it almost immediately. The work in Utah was just instantaneous, and you got a population increase associated with it. So where you have birds that can occupy it, I don't know the distance part. That part of that. Have you seen anything on distance? How far? How close they have to be to a treatment? Adjacency, I would say, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to put numbers on it.
Yeah.
Certainly, like where they're doing the juniper work in Oregon and stuff, they're seeing almost immediate use of those areas by adjacent grouse. So they're not going to move long distances, but if they're already, then we'll reach out into it. So.
I guess where I'm going is there's a lot of money going into restoration, rehabilitation, reclamation, but I think we need to keep in mind the idea ultimate is to have it repopulated. And if people are wasting money getting too far away or doing things that aren't beneficial, we get back to our economics. So I think we need, as we encourage this, we need to maybe, and I don't know the science, distance and things like that, geography and all that will affect that.
So keeping the birds on the landscape is number one.
I was just going to add, I think that's why we've stressed so much doing things adjacent to and keeping birds where we're doing particular damage, have birds peripheral. But the other thing that adds to that is the fact that the restorative work that they've done in translocating population in Oregon and Washington has been based around the fact that there were birds there. Where they've done it where there aren't birds, they get eaten. Where they've done it where there are birds, they adapt.
Couldn't they have legally Just one, because we had a conversation on the break about why this is such a relevant topic has to do with where we will choose to do mitigation particularly. And we're going to run into places where mitigation immediately in proximity to a disturbance is probably an incredibly high lift, whereas we got somewhere else where that mitigation can take place and augment an existing population. We've got to be smart about where we do this. I think that's kind of at the heart of your question is, where do we do it where we know we're going to get immediate lift? Those are the places we should be going.
Right, so if you go back in the presentation where we talked about the weighting factors, where we tried to create a plan of our priority areas, that gets right to that point, right? The easiest thing for us to have done is to go to that big burn up in the north and say, we're going to do a bunch of projects up there. That would be in the restoration team stood up and said, that's the best place to do it. Right? Easiest place, but not the best place. So, thank you very much. Thank you, Mike. On behalf of Chesapeake, I just want to say thank you for having us in and giving us report and look forward to continuing to work with folks. Thank you.
Update. Starts good. Bring these players out to first of all, they met out the governor and partner with Governor Free it was kind of paper. This last week was dropping into a full smooth swing. About the successes that we've had here, and we'll continue to drop that to the United States as well. The other things that I wanted to talk about quickly is as we move forward with our plan to deal with idle work as well in the state. We have moved forward with a contract with 130 some of those wells for the next 6-month period. Why that's important for this contract is that we've had them map that. I'll try and give you all a copy of those maps, but what it demonstrates is that we've found that we can do a number of those adjacent to core areas, which certainly hopefully over time will allow us to consider those in our future mapping discussion. So 134 we still have close to 1,400 left to go. I don't have a map of all of those in relationship to core areas, but our first priority are those adjacent to existing core areas.
And just a clarification on that, when we did look at the initial mapping, there are very few orphaned and abandoned in core. And so they wanted a prioritization of where to start. And I think the logical answer was adjacent so that you're able to look at expansion of those cores out into areas that were previously occupied. So that's where they went. I think it's ODCC did a great job.
And it's not just a building effort, there is a reclamation component that goes with that. So it's substantial work.
I understand that's so important that I don't know everybody else is tracking how many accident deaths there are engaged. Hopefully, I can stand there. It was terrific that you're pushing this issue.
And part of that too is WCC is also working with power line companies to see if we can pull some of those out and address that issue in terms of the conservation of those wells. The other thing that I wanted to do today was to invite all the members of the Sgit to the governor's office this week. On Thursday morning, the 11th, will sign the land treaty. That is certainly a major conservation effort for all of us. It's been a long time coming. The state has had its effort in place for quite a long time. We've been working to institute the protected fisheries and stipulations of executive order across the land ownership. We've had very firm control on that in relationship to the state lands, private lands of the state, and to the extent that we have any sort of regulatory control on federal lands on that. And now we will have one plan in place. We've got a long way to go. This will probably be the first, if whoever it is, frankly, the first
Issues, specifically related to liability requirements for our needs, and developing some desired conditions for the development and then discuss an ongoing conversation with the chief that we've been part of. Still working through, I think, if you get our full service of comments on the documents, and then moving forward and trying to continue to work on that. So I think we did have quite a bit. Jane, put that in your notes. Just so you go back and follow.
Actually, I don't have any. This one, like, something like agreements and the Buffalo and the Bighorn revisions are both on schedule for fall this year. The only other agency update that I have is that Caleb Minor has changed positions. He's now in the High Desert District. And Pam Murdoch has taken over his role as the state officer.
Well, I guess, and Jeremiah, you can help me with this, let me kind of tell you where we are with the Forest Service liability stuff. The issue is, and I think we said this in previous meetings, but again, to try and be transparent and up to date, the Forest Service has a completely different planning process than, makes very little sense, but and one of the requirements is we have to do a viability analysis on all species. Because of when they started this particular EIS, they are governed under 1982 viability assessment, even though it was changed in 2012. So 2012 is a pretty reasonable, normal type thing, but they're forced because of when they started it and when it was done to go to 1982. What that means is that we're trying to wade through consistency between executive order, BLM, and the Forest Service and tie that back to the service so that we have a consistent application across the landscape. And I'm about to explode now, so we'll probably stop talking about it, but it is an ordeal. If you want to add anything to that, you're going to explode too. Anyway, stay tuned. There's more to come.
Just a few things. The Water Conservancy Conservation Bank and the Upper Green River Conservation Exchange has submitted their agreements. The review team is working through those, so we'll continue to work with those. So just a heads up on that. As far as the statewide CCAA, we do have 7 completed applications that I've signed. Because they have to go through the register for public comments, we're going to batch them. We're going to batch this first 7 to get them through to see how the process goes. I would expect to see them hopefully within a month or 2, getting public comment, and then we can move forward and permits for those. In the meantime, we have hired someone actually repositioned her from oil and gas projects. Ollie and Holt will be helping out with the CCAAs, so that we'll have another person on the ground to get their applications in order for us to go ahead and sign. Just a heads up, the call, my understanding is it's supposed to come out next month, I believe on the 21st. So hopefully we can start gathering the information for the decision that will be made next year. Also got the note while we were in the meeting that the Endangered Species Act compensatory mitigation policy is coming out for interim review, which means it's actually moving, which is good to hear. Also, the state grouse mitigation framework is out to my state counterparts within the range for review. Comments are due at the end of this week, so hopefully that will be moved as well.
Okay. Nancy, thank you.
What do we have in the CCAs?
CCNs?
There's one that's being worked on right now. Once that process is set, it should go fairly smoothly, but we're going to work through that first one.
So, just a couple of things I want to mention. I'm really excited to start working with the metric and data collection tool that Mary's been working on. A couple of key staff have been involved in that as it's been ongoing. So we're going to be working with our organizations to take a look and learn more about that tool. We're looking forward to any training opportunities that I think will come in July and August, and developing some good policy within each of our divisions to make sure that we're populating that data as quickly as we can. So that's something that's we're really excited about.
Also, on that, would you please make sure that you and Mary stay pretty closely connected here, because it's going to be important to get the users inside as we move forward, and you guys are such a huge part of that, that I think it would be really helpful to have them informing us as to what works, what doesn't, what's missing, what, that.
Exactly. We're going to be touching base internally. We've got one point of contact for Sage Grouse data within each of our divisions. We're going to visit with them about what Craig Smith saw during the demonstration, figure out what works best for each of our divisions. It might not be the same across the board, but most definitely we'll be working closely with Craig, and we'll be offering, hopefully seeing some training opportunities where we'll be sending each representative from the divisions to that training.
We did do a beta test with all the agencies, right, and then including the federal agencies. So we did a sweep of fatal flaws. So we're into minor flaws, not fatal flaws.
Yeah, but I guess DEQ has so much of this that I think you're going to pick things up quicker than, say, a state engineer.
Oh, yeah, it's going to be
and so I really want to make sure that we're working just to inform us, because I think you guys work with it more. So
maybe there's an opportunity for some more focused training and just regarding the things that we can to make sure that we really understand what we need.
That would be great.
I'd be happy to facilitate that here. Really excited to see the efforts and the support that Nicholas needs to go forward with this digitizing. That's something that we're going to be watching pretty closely. Obviously, a big interest from DEQ's perspective and perspective of the mining industry. So, congratulations on that.
Mostly the same stuff, Forest Service Bible and mining plan, only thing I'd add is there's some changes to the ESA language and we're working on government office. That's about
Okay, yeah, Jeremiah stole most of my thunder. I'm not working well, but just to expand it a little bit, we've got 3 primary areas that we're going to be focusing on in 2014. First, that we're undergoing disruptions on is the Alpha Coal area south of Chile. And also we're on the ground around Spotted Horse, some open holes there. And then around U Cross Range east of Buffalo sometime this fall, there's been some irrigation issues in the Buffalo. A lot of those irrigation studies
we just wrapped up our final application period for SGI this year, so we're working on those applications. Moving on ahead, and then we've also been doing some quality assurance reviews on existing work and training. So,
I miss any other agencies. Where are you with?
Okay, wow. So I'm going to turn this over to Tom first to talk about what the sound has this year.
Just a couple things. One personal observation on the way over to Green River yesterday. So were several people who are at the Western States Safe Routes Workshop. A lot of really good science presented there. And if there's interest, I can send the abstracts from that file to the group with me. To Mary, okay. Maybe tidbits of this. You find interesting. Several papers are Wyoming based. Local work group update. All the groups are getting together right now to start funding a new round of projects using this year's appropriation from the legislature. So that's going on in your local communities. See, Bob actually mentioned the job completion reports. Those are up to date, which means through the spring of last year. They're on our website. So if you're interested in how your local St. Croix population is doing on the statewide, those reports are on our website. And finally, just with an asterisk being preliminary, that we are entering data this spring into the database. We're up to about, on a statewide basis, about half of the data entered. So that's a good sample that's entered now. Will all be entered by the end of July, and then we'll distribute the data like we normally do through our FTP site for those people that actually use that data. It will be public knowledge at that point. But right now, with half the data entered, it looks like we're going to have a pretty decent bump increase in average analog attendance. I'm going to give you a round number here, but remember the asterisks. This is preliminary. We're going to go, it looks like, from about 17 males per WEC to in the 20 range. So meaningful increase, which turns the corner on the downward phase of the cycle that been since 2007. Fairly predictable based on what we've seen over the last year and what we know about safe drought cycles. So looks like we've bottomed out, are pulling up again. And with the spring weather we've had, well, actually since last fall, we increased precipitation. Everybody sees how green it is out there, and we're also benefiting from that. One little caveat, some of the researchers are reporting some nest loss due to the Mother's Day storm. And then just this week, and also one of the Utah guys got John Q. Public sitting a picture of a brood of little mountain grouse that 8 chicks frozen in the wall. So those kinds of things happen, but I think what we've got so far is really good for nest success and chick survival. So, yeah, we're looking for some good things. Bob, do you have more?
Yeah, we're continuing to work on ECTs. It's we've got, I think, some additional money from the governor's office to help update the website. You know, as you guys work through it, you identify things that can be improved, and we've been working on that, and Nicholas has been doing an awesome job. And as you have heard, you know, Amanda's working with Chesapeake, Linda's working with the transmission folks, Scott's working with the mining folks. So it's not just Douglas Core area that has projects, it's across the state, and we're working with proponents who have sticky wickets, you know, in terms of the threshold, and we work through it, and we'll continue to bring those to you as we run across problems or issues. But I think industry has been incredibly responsive and open to ideas and very thoughtful about responses. So thanks to everybody who has done that.
Thank you. I have to say that you talk about statistics for a long time. With all the federal interest right now, having those statistics that we finally were able to put together because of hard work and implementation, we've been able to answer questions instead of have supposition. 60% plus reduction in conventional drilling, 1,369% increase in directional drilling. Those are the kind of things that were thoughtfully offered here. And I really want to thank Mary in particular and her team for being able to step up with a fairly high bar where we're being asked questions that we've never been asked before and being able to answer them
pushing forward.
And that's a lot of WAGTC as well, so
Well, thank you.
that's up to them, yeah.
Yeah, and that's well said. Last, Wildlife Natural Resource Trust, we will look at 49 projects on Thursday and grant funding. A good number of those always are sage grouse projects. We are again this time. Depending on what we get this fall, this could be the highest number of applications we've ever had. 49 in the spring is relatively unheard of, other than the first year when everybody had everything came off the shelf. We didn't fund 49, just looked at a lot more. It's really interesting to watch how those now are coming in. We got our first application from the Trolling Association, which was exciting. And that was a cooperative venture with a research project and management project. Don't know whether that will get funded. If not, we may come back to this group with that one because I think it's worthy, whether it fits up the trust or whether it fits somewhere else better in the city. But that's interesting because we're getting these multi aspect applications that include companies and conservation districts and travel unlimited, and they're all involved, which I think says a lot about where we're headed. So, with that, any other agencies? All right, one more shot. Public comment.
Just wanted to bring up some group issue that we talked about on the hot state nature. Our area with property landowner program, I call it expressed the interest in this prior to service. They'd like to do a CCAA. The question that we ask is, can you use one CCA on a piece of property in Colorado? And tell you, one of the big parts is back in Colorado. A significant number of birds nest in one home. So the question is, and I think it's appropriate for this group to also air that. It is a great concern that we need to develop this mechanism and message branches and private lands that significant holdings across the state line. It doesn't make much sense to put a CCAA that's not going to just sit down and actually have the majority of the collection of grouse. In some cases, on the other side of the line, so it's an issue.
Well, administratively, it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to have to do it. Sir, I just want to respond real quickly. They're using the Wyoming CCAA as a template for each wide. So any state, any individual can use that template to come up with their own CCAA, but it's all based on Wyoming CCAA. If you run a flagpole internally and see if someone could do a CCAA on their entire ranch, even if it crosses the state line. I think that's, if the answer is that that's not a difficulty, then that's really going to help us. And then they may choose to do it in Colorado and bring it into
They're interested in doing this, doing a CCAA, but another question is, how am I Colorado? That's really what I'm going to say to us. I'm still in the center. So it's something that we need to be patient about.
Let's mark on that ground first. Take a shot at it. Thank you. Public comment. Yes, sir.
Yeah, kind of a common question. Both of us it's back to the state and going to wells, et cetera. Maybe you've already thought about this one. You haven't. Just wondering if the government any programs across the state of Wyoming and the backups and all the board, but are we kind of casing off the program level between the rifles out there rather than having these 5 to 6 foot high bird perches in the middle of the location that we're done? I've seen agencies go back and forth with one about ground rifle marker or ground rifle marker, but not sure where we're at today, but we encourage whatever the gas commission and BLM to look at setting them all off below ground.
That's a great point. Is there a problem with that? But we're on there being cut off 3 foot, I think, of those circuits. Right now, all of them are. That's a huge difference maker.
The background is kind of marking describing the
Well, they're not painted white. Okay, other public comment. All right, let's go around the table, Dave. Joe, you done? Okay. Mark? All right. Of course. What? You have nothing to say? Of course.
I just want to this information. Livestock grazing is not considered unanimous. To give the executive order concerned, existing grazing operations under a management plan are considered unanimous. As chair of our grazing subcommittee, we also put in place, reaffirmed that proper grazing is not addressed. However, there is a procedure in place if there's some indications that there is improper grazing. There's a procedure put in place to address that. And also the 7-inch double height, I think that is proper cover. The best habitat is in mosaic pattern, grasses, olives, and brush. Contain those items, but they do not have to be monolithic height. That's not the best habitat for seed them. And in my usual concern about, we are concerned about what's out there. We're going to have to get some management of the vital/middle horse populations, because all of this will come down to food if we can get that changed. Thank you. I've got a question, I guess, trying to answer pretty much, but last week there was towards by-state population. And the way the article was written, it didn't sound like what actually means towards groundbreaking and so on, so landmark decision, so on and so forth. And I guess one question is any different than the other money that the SGI or other states different. But more importantly, conservation is with cooperating practices. But then it almost, I guess more importantly, it mentioned the proposal also proposes to put 1.8 million acres of critical habitat.
So you've got about 3 questions in there. Okay, so let's do the critical habitat first, because I think that's where you start. So Mark, you want to explain critical habitat component?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest with you, population. So I don't think that's the official one that proposal. I'm gonna double check it and make sure. But typically, when a draft rule comes out, 2 listing species, there will also be a critical habitat designation as well. But as far as the designating critical habitat population, anything that there doesn't mean that it's not correct. I'm just going to check it.
I think the proposal is that all suitable habitat within the by-state.
Is that because it's already been proposed?
And it's on a different track. Yeah. And then Brian, you want to address some of the SGI?
No, I was going to say that, and that's the big difference. The program will be the same, but and the program and the form. But what we obviously don't understand, but they had a pretty successful SGI program. They acquired and contracts canceled. Once the listing decision came out, that people were working with people and were interested. And I think kind of that urge and, you know, we try to, I guess, increase our efforts there and try to get a little bit assistance from the allowing service, try to continue to implement that program and provide people some level of assurance that we're headed for this season. And I think it's going to be our approach with that summer. Definitely will work with me.
The other part of that, Lyndon, is when the bi-state stuff was all going on, I was working with Nevada on their plan. We were able to go through the Nevada governor's office, and Bruce Peterson is the con out in Nevada, and mobilize some GRP money that was unused in other states and put that all into the bi-state. That's the money that Brian is talking about. That when the listing came out, all those agreements, they said, forget it. And so I think they're trying to put that back together to assure that the habitat is taken care of. Bi-state's a very different beast than what we're dealing with. It's almost like a gas, except it's not subsidies. So
one of the things that I guess the flags that were concerning me was critical habitat observation, and then I mentioned more than once in the article that this was just the beginning of it. That's and all other but what 11 western states, greater sagebrush.
I think that was probably a connection that wasn't made. The SGIs, let's call it, but this is an apple and orange thing.
Okay. Somebody might come in and designate one area gets around and it's great.
It's not listed. Okay. Brian, anything? Okay. Brett?
I think the question, and the good news is we have a lot of wet rainy season. Bad news is we have a lot of wet. They're using our fire session, proactive remediation plan, and others.
From the BLM side, yes, that core areas are a priority for immediate response and aggressive control. Most of the counties have adopted the same. We have kind of a unified fire agreement through state forestry, BLM, Forest Service, and county fire. And so if you've got a specific question in your area, go to county fire first, and then you can work right through the chain.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I set update on the Outlook and U.S. Fishing listeners? They're working on a using for sagebrush with electric utilities. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife there for final review, and it should be available in this summer.
Great. All right. Mary, you got anything else?
Sign-in sheet, please put your name on it.
Why don't you send them all a text?
I might.
All right, folks.
Next meeting, July 8th or August 12th. Those are the next second Tuesdays.
July 8th.
I know, that would be the next one, but so August 12th. We're at Lander.
Yeah, I suppose, what if you want to come out and stack hay or something, don't you?
Well, we can find some activity. Run for grouse.
I think we'll meet at Doug's. He'll buy, and we'll just have a meeting out there. Huh? All right.
Okay.
Yeah, let's shoot for Lander. We'll get back to you.
Okay, August 12th.
August 12th. All right.
Thank you for all your help.